votes. I thought she did, but from memory, I don't have it in front of me, although I can easily find it. It won't be very difficult. I think I'm right in saying that the vote for the confirmatory public vote, the vote for a confirmatory referendum, received 268 votes and was defeated. Well, the Honourable Lady is shaking her head, but I'm trying to answer the point. I think it received 268 votes and was opposed by 295, so it was defeated. But again, if the Honourable Lady will forgive me, and even if she won't, I repeat the point that this is part of a process for which the House voted, and colleagues did so in the knowledge that a result might not be achieved on day one or even necessarily on day two, but the House wanted that process to take place. It may be, I haven't looked at the division lists and it's absolutely her right, it may be that the Honourable Lady voted against this process altogether, and I completely respect her autonomy in making that judgment, but the House chose to adopt this process, and what I have done and am doing is entirely in keeping with the spirit of that process.
Confirmation.
Is it further to? I'm not sure there is a further to.
It is further. So the 85 I'm referring to was when the honourable member for Totnes brought the vote before the House, not the last vote.
I'm sorry, I didn't realise that was what the Honourable Lady was saying. OK, but my point about the discrete process that we're undertaking and the level of support for that particular motion stands. And what I have tried to do, and I say this not least so that our proceedings are intelligible to those who are not members of the House but are watching, is to identify those propositions that appear to command substantial support and preferably of a cross-party nature. That is what I have done, and it does seem to me, if I may say so, that although it can't please everybody, it is quite a reasonable approach, as opposed to, for example, identifying a series of propositions which have minimal support and thinking that it will be a frightfully good sport instead to submit them to a verdict of the House again. That wouldn't seem to me a particularly constructive way in which to proceed. So I'm for a constructive approach, and I hope most of the House will agree with me that that is how we should operate. Can we now move to the main debate? And I call the Father of the House, the Right Honourable and Learned Gentleman, the Member for Rushcliffe, and he who owns motion C on the Customs Union to address the House, Mr Kenneth Clark.
Well, Mr Speaker, may I first of all say that I hope for the reputation of this House and the reputation of the political institutions of this country that we are going to achieve a majority for at least a couple of these motions this afternoon in order to reassure the public that we do know what we're doing, or we're beginning to know what we're doing, and we are capable of delivering responsible government and looking after the national interest in the present crisis. I think most honourable and right honourable members must have appreciated at the weekend how little respect the public as a whole have at the moment for their political institutions, and how very low the regard is in which they hold what's going on in this House. The House has blocked the government's policy, won't vote for the withdrawal agreement. It's against that, a rather curious mixture of votes. It last week had a process and voted against the propositions before it, and if we are to avoid ludicrous deadlock, today is the day when the House has to indicate that there is a majority, there is a consensus in favour of something positive that would give some guidance to where we're going. And I'm going to give very ready. I might when I've got going, but we've got so little time. The filibustering of the business motion means we have very little time for debate. So I am going to make an effort to be very short, and I don't think, with respect to my old friend as well as my honourable friend, I won't give way. That means that last week was understandable. People plumped a bit for what they wanted to come forward, and we spread so widely over 8 motions that nothing actually got a majority. But today, I trust, people will vote for more than one motion if they can live with more than one motion, because if we just keep plumping for our one and only solution, we'll find we're broken up. This is the process that my right honourable friend for Dorset West, I think, had in mind when he introduced this. I voted for, I think, 5 of the motions last week, and as I shall argue, I don't think they're incompatible with each other. Some are larger than others and swallow one within the other. Some are on really separate subsets of the problem. What we're all asking ourselves in this deadlock is what compromise would each and every member be prepared to accept in the national interest? Well, I'll give way to, sorry, I apologise for that, friend. I'll give way to my right honourable friend once, as this is his process.
I'm enormously grateful to my right honourable friend. Can I just say how very much I agree with every word he's spoken? And does he agree with me that the reason we're holding this debate today and the reason we're in this unusual process is not because we're interested in some zany constitutional theory, but because our country faces the prospect on Thursday week of leaving without a deal if this House does not come together and find some way forward.
Well, the two of us are in complete agreement. I entirely agree with my right honourable friend, and as he quite rightly says, we must avoid no deal occurring in a fortnight's time simply because the House of Commons couldn't agree on anything by default. In fact, the House of Commons, 400 members of it, have voted against no deal, and it would be calamitous just to collapse into it because we cannot reach any compromise between each other of what we actually wish to put forward. And so I try and illustrate that my particular motion, which is for a permanent customs union, it is perfectly compatible with a wider look at the subject, but it sets a basic agenda, and I think it will help to ensure that what I regard as the damaging consequences of leaving the European Union are minimised, and we can reassure the absolutely panic-stricken, sometimes, business and other interests in this country who view the great unknown and the end of the common market with great concern. And I hope the public, who are as polarised as this House in their opinions at the moment, will begin to be reassured and people will be reconciled on a compromise of leaving the political European Union but staying in the common market, to use the language of Eurosceptics over the years. No, I'm not going to give away, because, I'd say, just had 2 hours filibustering, and I don't want my speech to be spun out. Firstly, let me illustrate why I think my particular motion C does not conflict with the body of opinion in most of the political parties in this House. Firstly, the Conservative Party. My motion does not conflict with the Prime Minister's withdrawal agreement. Indeed, it slightly complements it, deals with a different subject. Motion C is dealing with the political arrangement, the non-binding political declaration, and the nature of the later negotiations that will have to take place to determine our long-term future. As I said last week, it answers the concerns of the Labour Party, who have supported it, who say they will not vote for the withdrawal agreement, not because of the contents of the withdrawal agreement, but because it's a blind Brexit. You have absolutely no idea what the government's going to do and would be giving them a blank sheet of paper for this House to approve the withdrawal agreement and then carry on arguing inside the Cabinet for what objectives they're going to seek in the negotiations that would then follow. What this motion suggests is that this House mandates the government, whatever shape the government takes, whatever government, in the negotiations to make a permanent customs union one of its foundations. And I'll come back later to the only reason that ever given for being against the customs union, which is the only basis for voting against it. Now, I'm not going to give way. It's unfair to other members who've had this whole debate crammed into 3 hours. In 1972, we used to have all-night sittings on much smaller issues than this. I don't recommend going back to that. But I do object to listening to my colleagues having to speak on 3-minute time limits, because chaps want to get to dinner and won't sit after 7 o'clock in the evening in the middle of the week, which is where this rather pathetic Parliament has got itself into recently. But that's my last digression from my theme. Let me... I've already said it does not conflict with the government's withdrawal agreement. If this motion is passed, or it's subsumed by Common Market 2, which I will also vote for, and that subsumes this one if it's carried, then the easiest way of proceeding is for the government to proceed with its withdrawal agreement tomorrow, the Labour Party to abstain because it's no longer such a blind Brexit, and for get on to the serious negotiations which this country has not yet with its 27 partner nations. It doesn't conflict, motion C, with the case that's being made by many members for a further referendum, either a confirmatory referendum or a people's vote. It isn't on the same subject. The referendum is about whether a public vote has got to be determined whether the public have changed their mind and whether we are actually firmly committed to the EU now that we know what is happening. That's a process, a very important process that we're arguing about. I've been abstaining on that. I'm not very fond of referendums myself, but there we are. But what this motion C is concerned with is a quite different subject. It's the substance of the negotiations. If we get beyond April the 12th, and it's beginning to set out what the government has a majority for, what it's being given a mandate for when it starts those negotiations. And the separate issue of whether, once any stage, at any relevant stage, a referendum is called for, can be debated and voted on quite separately. Advocates of a people's vote are not serving any particular interest if they vote for a people's vote and somehow vote against this to make sure that that somehow gets a bigger majority. Both can be accommodated. I should be accused of bias if I give way to my right honourable friend. So I urge the Liberals to proceed on that basis. Similarly, the Scottish Nationalists. I mean, I agree with them that I would much prefer to stay in the European Union. But I'm afraid, in this trying to give this country some good and stable governance by giving it shares to the House of Commons, I've compromised on that because a huge majority seems to me to have condemned us to leaving the European Union. But I've tabled motions with the Scottish Nationalists, and I've voted with the Scottish Nationalists that we should revoke Article 50 if the dread problem of no deal seems to be looming towards us by accident, and I will again. I can't understand why the Scottish Nationalists will not at least contemplate, if they can't get their way and stay in the European Union, voting for a permanent customs union, which will benefit business in Scotland, business the economy in Scotland, just as much as here, and is not remotely incompatible with pursuing their wider aims, as I mentioned them, and I will of course give the honourable lady the right to reply.
Very grateful to the right honourable and learned gentleman for giving way. The reason that the SNP cannot support his motion today is that for the Scottish economy, freedom of movement is vital, and we don't get freedom of movement without the single market. So that's the reason we can't support his motion.
I will be voting for a single market if it's presented in a proper way. I would have voted for the motion down in the name of my honourable friend, the member for Penzance, last week, if he had not at the end added a gratuitous sentence saying that it ruled out any question of a customs union. And, if you can get a majority, if we can get a majority of the single market, I will vote for it again. And then, if we pass a motion of the single market, if we pass Common Market 2, which is to be moved by my honourable friend, no doubt later in the course of the debate, well, I quite accept then my motion is subsumed. But I'm not confident that we're going to get a motion for the single market because the Scotnats are attracted by freedom of movement. Many of my right honourable and honourable friends are provoked into voting against it because of freedom of movement. Similarly, Common Market 2 is ambitious. I would settle for that, but too ambitious, probably. So mine is, as it were, the fallback position. And I cannot see how the Scottish Nationalists, I think my honourable friend does vote for my motion. There's no threat to the Scottish Nationalist position by voting for me. There's no threat by voting for mine as well. Indeed, it is an insurance, going back to how I started, to make sure that we move forward and the government has a mandate given by this House of Commons, which we can then go on to ensure it actually has to follow in mapping out this nation's future. And in the long negotiations over the next 2 or 3 years, questions of regulatory alignment, questions of freedom of movement, questions of... we'll all start coming into the negotiations again. The fact that we've committed ourselves to a permanent customs union will not actually compromise any of those discussions as we go forward. I'd even address the Democratic Unionist Party, because I haven't the faintest idea why they are not supporting Motion C. If you pass Motion C, it means you have no tariffs, you have no certificates of origin. The Irish border question, pretty well, is solved. You're well on the way, 90-odd% on the way to maintaining the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, and actually it will be of huge benefit to the Irish economy and, of course, to Irish security, and it would also mean that the DUP's objection to the Irish backstop, that Northern Ireland's being treated differently from the rest of the UK, vanishes. Pass Motion C, and it applies to the entire of the United Kingdom. And I'll give way, as I'm referring to the honourable member, but I am a Unionist. And he thinks the Irish backstop is not a Unionist proposition. Motion C is a Unionist proposition and does no harm to the DUP's position at all.
I'm glad to hear that the member has said that he's a Unionist, though in supporting the withdrawal agreement 3 times he has shown that he does not respect the views of the people of Northern Ireland who believe that it puts it in jeopardy. But could I just say to him that a customs union alone does not resolve the issue of the border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic in the terms that the EU have expressed it, because the single market rules are equally important in their argument that you would need to have regulatory checks, though of course we know from their no-deal preparations that whether you're in a customs union or a single market, or not in a customs union or a single market, doesn't really matter, because they don't intend to put checks on the border anyway.
Firstly, I do agree. To have an open border, unless we invent these magic X-ray cameras, which some of my friends think are imminently about to be discovered, you need to be in a customs union and you have to have some degree of regulatory alignment. But in the case of the Irish border, and I think in the case of Dover, you've got 90% of the way with the customs union, and as I say, it isn't the customs union that's inconsistent with his aim and mine, which is a totally free-moving, frictionless, to use the Prime Minister's phrase, border, and the Channel in England and in Ireland, and the same arrangements applying to both. And he cites the fact that, unfortunately, the withdrawal agreement has the Irish backstop in it. Motion C makes the Irish backstop irrelevant, superfluous. It's never going to feature if we pass Motion C. Now, I'm sorry, I should go back to being strict, but when I refer to parties or people, I feel it's courteous to actually let them respond to me. So let me just deal finally, very briefly, with the only substantial argument that has been raised against the customs union in this House from beginning to end of our debates. And that is that it will stop us having our own customs arrangements with third-party countries. And that is the one that's repeated by ministers over and over again. Firstly, no, I'm not going to allow it. First, in the interest of other people, I'm sorry, Greg. Firstly, it's not actually accurate, that. It is true that trade agreements with other countries will not be able to make changes to the tariffs, the external tariffs that we will have, because, of course, we would have the benefit of no tariffs at all, totally tariff-free entry into the rest of the EU. But what you would be able to have trade agreements on is the service economy, service industries, which are the vast majority of the GDP in this country. And I've been involved in trade negotiations over the years quite a lot. And this isn't vanity, it's simply my longevity that makes me say that probably I've had more experience of trade arrangements and dealings than any other member of this House. Every department I've been in, I've led trade delegations to somewhere or other. My spell at the Department of Trade and Industry, my spell at the Treasury, I got heavily involved, particularly with Americans and with China and with large parts of Latin America in trade deals. And in the last government, the coalition government, I led for the British government on the EU-US TTIP negotiations. Because although the Commission conducts the negotiations on a mandate that's been given by the 28 member states, certainly the bigger ones, like Britain, remain a constant presence and go backwards and forwards to try to make sure it's going smoothly. So I have been involved in many attempts to get trade deals, some successful, some not. Opening up the Chinese market is a very slow business. I could have told President Trump, and certainly tell this House. But going back to the American one, which some of my right honourable and honourable friends put great weight upon, the TTIP failed. Well, firstly, it was given that strange title, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, because Obama's officials said you wouldn't get anything called a free trade agreement past America. It's quite a protectionist country. Certainly Congress is. And that was under Obama. And the problem with the Americans, first of all, is that what we wanted was to open up access to services. Tariffs don't matter much in European-American trade. There are vestigial tariffs. All the Europeans, including the British, quite content to abandon tariffs in both directions. They're quite small, and the auto industry on both sides of the Atlantic didn't really want their tariffs. Now, it's regulatory differences and getting regulatory equivalence or convergence that stands in the way. We wanted the Americans to open up public procurement, which they wouldn't, and anyway it's a state-by-state thing which makes it more difficult, and to open up the service sector, particularly financial services. And the lobbies in Congress are too strong to make much progress. The present president has given no indication that he would open up any market to us. The approach he's taken to trade negotiations, when he talks about a trade agreement and takes on the Mexicans, the Canadians, the Chinese, is he wants America to export more to them and them to export less to America. And we have a large trade surplus in America, and that's what he has in mind. It's perfectly plain. And his obsession is with food and agricultural products. And that means giving up our standards of animal welfare and food quality, which British lobbying have got very high standards in Europe, taking the lower standards in America with hormone-treated beef and chicken. And if you think you're going to influence that if you get such a trade agreement, we can somehow start tightening up American food standards and animal welfare, I can only tell you that the agricultural lobby in Congress is extremely powerful, and they wouldn't take the slightest notice of British interests on such matters. And Australia probably would have a deal. You have to face a problem of hormone-treated beef. That's what they want to export to us. The New Zealanders want a deal, but as long as you lift the quotas on their tariff-free exports of lamb, I'm sure they'd be happy if we can think of anything we wish to sell to New Zealand that we don't sell at the moment. But these negotiations are not going to compensate for the loss of our European markets if we stay outside the customs union and the single market and erect great barriers in our way. So I've made the case, and I really do think it is modest. It's modest compared with my own views. There's nobody in this House who's a greater supporter of the European project. There's nobody in this House who wants more than me to see Britain remain in the European Union if that was in the realm of the possible. But to reject motion C again would run the risk of the adverse reaction outside that we got when, as I think we all anticipated we would, we got minorities for every motion last week. Now is the time for people to get behind this. If they wish to get behind Common Market 2, feel free. If they wish to reinforce the revocation argument, if we otherwise would crash out with no deal, vote for that. So far, this process has been a shambles. The public are holding almost in contempt their political parties and their politicians and the institutions of government. Today, we've got to start to bring that to an end. All I'm putting forward is a modest step compared with most on the order paper. This modest step is perfectly compatible with the wider ambitions of a large majority of this House. So it's fitting, Mr. Speaker, I should open the debate, because I think mine is the basic, obvious beginning. If the House wishes to add more, I shall probably vote with them.
Order. Thank you. I'm keen to accommodate all of those whose motions have been selected and to do so before calling others. I'm not imposing a formal time limit at this stage, but there is a premium upon time and therefore upon brevity. Mr. Peter Kyle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The motion I speak to today, motion E, is an attempt to bring us all together. It's an attempt to restore the kind of politics that will allow us to overcome the greatest challenges. We need to recognise that this House is in peril, not just of a disastrous Brexit outcome, but in peril of failing so far the popular esteem that we may well never recover public trust. We have lost the art of politics because we have become gridlocked by the politics of position. We have taken our positions, usually in groups, and effectively gone to war against all the other groups. There has been a heavy price to pay, even beyond the battering and the bruising of the opposing views. That price has been paid outside this chamber in what has now become an ever more divided and fractious country.
Will he give way?
I'll give way in a moment. I will give way, but I'm going to try and make as much progress as I possibly can. It is also a bemused country which demands that we chart a new course forward. After 3 years of assault and counterattack, no position has emerged victorious. Instead, the politics of this House have been even more diminished and entrenched. Nothing will change if we're not prepared to move. A solution will emerge only if we make it so.
I thank the honourable member for giving way and for his very thoughtful tone. I'd like to ask a clarifying question. What is the question in the referendum that he is proposing? Given we've already voted to leave in 2016, I'm assuming the question in his referendum would be leave with the government's deal or leave with no deal.
Well, I'm grateful that the honourable gentleman is predicting where I'm going to get to in my speech, and I think that would be the time to answer the question once I've addressed it, because I think you can predict the fact that we will get there pretty soon. The solution, I believe, is to work with what we have before us, to accept the world as it is, not the world as we would like it to be. After the referendum, I travelled to Norway, I met negotiators, I met ministers, I visited the EEA in Brussels, and I worked alongside colleagues to champion a soft Brexit, which I then voted for. For those who say that I and others like me have simply tried to scupper Brexit from the start, they are wrong. I've also voted with every proposition from my own front bench, and I would encourage others to do the same in a way, as another way to achieve compromise and consensus. And I congratulate the Leader of the Opposition and the Shadow Brexit Secretary for their excellent work in crafting a set of Brexit policies that puts the future of our economy and workers first and foremost. I believe that if they had done so from within a position within government, then we would be able to present a deal to Parliament that would have been accepted. That is why our amendment relates to a deal and not specifically the government's deal, because I know many people on these benches still long for a better proposition than the one that's on offer. But we must be honest with each other. When the Prime Minister triggered Article 50 process, we all knew, whether we voted for it or against, that it bestowed on government the right to negotiate a deal on behalf of the British government. That deal is before us, and it defines Brexit. I will.
A serious point on obviously what they would put before the British public. How long does he think it would take to craft a new deal? And does that mean he anticipates fighting the European elections because they need a lot of time to craft a whole new deal?
I'm grateful to the honourable lady, and I encourage everybody to look in this direction rather than another direction. But I am not suggesting with this proposition that we do propose another deal. I'm proposing with this that we accept the landscape we are standing on exactly in the manner that I have just suggested. The deal before us is one that defines Brexit. And as it stands, this sovereign parliament has rejected it again and again and again. In fact, Mr. Speaker, MPs have cast a staggering 1,167 votes against this deal.
The colleagues, to show some respect for the member who has the floor. The honourable gentleman has had his motion selected, and he's entitled to be heard. On a point of order, Mr. Stephen Doughty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Obviously, the debate we're undergoing at the moment is of extreme importance, and it's vital that members are able to hear, particularly the speeches made by the proponents of the different motions today, as I'm sure you would agree. Obviously, there is a disturbance in the gallery, whatever the rights and wrongs of that protest. I'm sure, Mr. Speaker, you will agree that we need to ensure that the people can be heard in this debate, and that we need to ensure that the gallery is appropriately handled in order to make sure that we can proceed with the debate and the proceedings in here today.
Time, I suggest we proceed. Mr. Peter Kyle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As it stands, this Parliament, the sovereign Parliament, has rejected this deal again and again and again. In fact, MPs have cast a staggering 1,167 votes against this deal. That's 50% more than the MPs that sit in this chamber. However, although the majority here don't like it, the fact remains that it has been signed off by every EU country, by the EU itself, and by the British Parliament. It is the only deal that is on the table. And just there, we have to accept that there is no majority for the government's deal, neither is there a majority right now for an alternative. So we have a stark choice. Do we continue the war of positions in the hope that one side will capitulate, knowing the damage it will do to our politics and to our country? Do we persist with the deadlock, or do we choose to progress? If there is no outright majority for one of the propositions, then we must do what the country is desperate for. We must compromise by bringing together two minority positions to create a majority to move forward. Of course I will.
So that he might be able to collect his thoughts. And can I just say I congratulate him on speaking in the way that he is, notwithstanding some of other stuff that may be going on. In any event, would he agree with me it's really important tonight that everybody believes the people's vote, absolutely votes for a people's vote, and doesn't get distracted by anything else?
I'm very grateful for the intervention, and what a great sight she is, focusing in front of me, much more so than the peripheral vision that was tempting my eyes elsewhere. The bottom line is... Mr. Speaker, I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
Thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, and can I also thank him for the constructive way that he has worked with those on the other side of the divide, albeit who also come to the same conclusion as he has, which is this. that we can either keep on seeing Parliament as an absolute failure, delivering nothing, or we can actually put this back and actually get legal certainty. This is the only option that gives that certainty.
I'm very, very grateful to the honourable member for Bexhill, and he has been a fantastic person to work in partnership with on this, listening to him and learning from the experiences he has and the way he has approached the votes that he has made in this place has informed the way that we move forward with compromise. But the naked truth is, Mr. Speaker, that 202 members have loyally voted for the Prime Minister's deal 3 times now. This is a principled stance. But simply repeating the same exercise will not see loyalty rewarded. I give way.
I think the honourable gentleman for giving way. I have long said that if this House cannot find a solution to the Venn diagram that is Brexit, then all options, including confirmatory vote, must remain on the table. But does he acknowledge that any route from here is not consequence-free? And does he acknowledge that a second referendum could be much more divisive than it is decisive?
I'm grateful for the cheeky intervention from the right honourable gentleman. He makes a good point, because, but just because something has happened in the past, and let's accept that the 2016 referendum was a challenging one for our country, the next public vote needn't be, and we have a role to play in that. If we choose to lead the country in a different way, we have a hope of not repeating the 2016 experience, but making it one that reconciles more than divides. That is the hope we have going forward, and we are not slaves to the past. Let's be masters of the future. I give way.
He's fleshing out his arguments very well indeed. But what I wanted to say really was that we can't keep going round in circles. And this Parliament has nearly spent 3 years debating this topic, not finding a consensus. And I think we all now need to understand that we have to break that deadlock. And he is right to say that really the only way we can do that is through a public vote. And surely it makes more sense to have a public vote on the matter at hand, which is the route forward on Brexit, than a general election that may result in different MPs but still a hung Parliament and no direction.
I'm very grateful for her intervention. As you'll see in just a moment, that I rephrase and reframe the way that she posited it, but agree with the general direction. I'm going to make some progress. I promised the Speaker that I would speak for about 6 minutes, and I'm trying so hard to honour that promise. Last week, 268 members voted for the principle of a confirmatory ballot. It was the largest number of votes for any alternative Brexit proposition until that point. The principle of a confirmatory ballot has been used effectively twice in the last 20 years, both times to solve the complex and divisive issues. The first was on the Belfast or Good Friday Agreement. A lot of people, institutions and organisations were asked to give a lot to cement the deal. But together they gained a lot, despite sections of the Northern Irish society strongly rejecting it. The Good Friday Agreement was put to a confirmatory ballot which confirmed the deal and led to a decisive end to the arduous process and a peace that has endured to this day. I do not want to risk undoing those gains. It's another reason why we need to unlock our politics. The second instance, I'm going to make some progress, but I will allow him a bit later. A second instance was on the AV referendum in 2011. Electoral reform had been hotly contested and was a regular feature of public debate. It was also divisive within the coalition government. However, both Tory and Lib Dem parliamentarians were able to work together to legislate for it, because afterwards it would be subjected to a confirmatory public ballot. The innovation of confirmatory ballot is important because it's binding on government. Once confirmed or rejected, it doesn't even need to return to Parliament. In the case of the Good Friday Agreement, it was agreed. In the case of the AV referendum, it was rejected. But in both instances, the matter was settled instantly. as it would be in this case. No return to Parliament, no more squabbling, no best of three, no neverendum, just a definitive end to the Brexit impasse. Talking of which, I give way to the honourable gentleman.
He's kept his word, Mr. Speaker, and I'm extremely grateful to him for that. And his idea would have some merit had it not been for the fact that in 2017 we had a general election, which his party and my party both fought on our manifestos, saying that we would fulfil what was in the manifestos, which was to deliver Brexit. 80% of the people voted either Labour or Conservative. Doesn't he therefore believe, as what I've heard from my constituents over the past few weeks, which is just get on with it?
What about the rest
Well, I'll just point out to the honourable gentleman that the manifesto was published 2.5 weeks after I agreed to stand as a Labour candidate, and the deal that we are now debating was released a year and a half after the general election. We didn't see checkers, we didn't see what the negotiating stances of government were, we didn't see the deal for months and months and months after that general election. So that we didn't, by standing on either manifesto, give a blank cheque to government to deliver any deal in response. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
Just briefly, the simple answer to the manifesto point is that we as a coalition government had a completely different set of policies worked out literally behind closed doors after the 2010 election, and we lost the 2017 election. The reason that Brexiteers cite the manifesto is because they're trying to stop Parliament having a say on Brexit. I wonder if I could ask the honourable gentleman, is he aware, as I read in the Times this morning, of a letter that's been sent, apparently a secret letter by 170 Conservative MPs to the Prime Minister, which they refused to publish, apparently advocating no deal, in direct contravention of a resolution passed in this House, showing a complete lack of respect?
I'm very grateful I wasn't aware of the letter, but it's something that we've seen time and time again here, and we have to ask ourselves a fundamental question. Is people going to checkers behind closed doors and discussing stitch-up deals? Is people writing letters to the Prime Minister that aren't in the public domain? Is this an elitist stitch-up, or is getting Brexit out of Parliament, out of Westminster and into every community up and down our country an elitist stitch-up? One of those two is, and I believe with my heart, I'm on the right side of the argument so far. So this motion offers two benefits which members of this House cannot afford to ignore. It breaks the deadlock in Parliament, and I reassure colleagues on opposition benches that this motion makes explicit that Parliament is withholding consent for the deal until it is confirmed by the public. It cannot be said that by supporting the motion today that you're supporting the deal. Secondly, it allows us to offer a definitive end to this nightmare. It is a sign of failure that we could not resolve Brexit alone. In just one moment I shall do. It is a sign of failure that we could not resolve Brexit alone, but it is at least an honest one to admit our failure. We owe an apology to the public for the need to return to them one more time, but at least it will be only one more time.
From giving way. Isn't the essence of the problem that the original referendum was not defined in terms of whether it was binding or, as the government said at the time, advisory, and as a result it has led to lots of complications. But this referendum would be clearly a final say, and therefore there will be no ambiguity, and that is what the people deserve.
Good point.
I'm very grateful for the intervention, and I simply couldn't agree more. This time, voters will be making decisions based on facts and not promises. They can compare the deal on offer with the one we have already. The consent they give will be an informed consent. It is time, and it is time that we can only do this by backing a compromise. If we do not back this compromise, we could be stuck here in Parliament debating this for weeks and months to come. Brexit has to be returned to the people of the United Kingdom for them to issue their final instruction. And then together we can begin the reconciliation our country so desperately needs, but which today seems so far away. Motion E makes this possible. And, Mr. Speaker, the possibility is the very art of politics.
Mr. Nicholas Edward Coleridge Bowles. Very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to congratulate the honourable gentleman on managing to deliver a powerful speech with a certain amount of distraction. The honourable gentleman was responsible for my defeat in his own constituency in 2005, not as the candidate, but as the campaign manager, and I've always been slightly frightened of him ever since. Now, Mr. Speaker, I find myself wondering whether it's a coincidence entirely that the people who normally sit around me on these benches are not here, given that we all know that among them are counted noted naturists. But, Mr. Speaker, it has long been a thoroughly British trait to be able to ignore pointless nakedness, and I trust that the House will now be able to return to the issue that we are discussing. In last Wednesday's debate on the business of the House motion, my great friend and mentor, the honourable member for Mid Sussex, urged the House to take to heart the words that are recited every day during prayers by the Speaker's chaplain, that we should never lead the nation wrongly through love of power, desire to please, or unworthy ideals, but laying aside all private interests and prejudices, keep in mind our responsibility to seek to improve the condition of all mankind. In the 9 years since I arrived in this House, there has never been a day or a debate in which this injunction has been more relevant. If by doing this a clear majority of honourable and right honourable members are able to support one of the Brexit compromises on the order paper today, the vast majority of the people we represent will breathe a deep sigh of relief. We are sent here to make the most difficult decisions on behalf of our constituents. If we vote for a compromise version of Brexit this evening, they will see that we are up to the job. I give way to the honourable lady.
Friend, because he is my friend, for giving way. As he knows, I have made the case and voted for the single market and the customs union for the last almost 2 years. My difficulty with his motion is that, as it says in point 1, small paragraph 1, that it seeks to renegotiate the framework of the future relationship. And I think he would have won more support, if I may say, if, like at least motion C in relation to the customs union, that seeks to change the withdrawal agreement as well as the future framework. And his problem with this amendment is that it's only about the future relationship, which any government and any Prime Minister that succeeds the current can change. It is non-binding, in other words.
And I thank my honourable friend right honourable friend for her point, but I don't actually agree. I have specifically included within my motion a provision that the political declaration, as renegotiated, should then be cemented into the Withdrawal Act, as it will come if this House votes for it, and therefore will require a majority of this House to vote to amend statute if there is to be a change. So it will not be simply a matter of a future leader of the Conservative Party being able to rip it up and renegotiate it. They will have to amend an Act of Parliament in this House, and currently there is no majority for amending it in the direction that she fears.
I'm really grateful, and I do agree that the public would be relieved if we ever did come to a conclusion, but they'll be angry if we come to the wrong conclusion. And will you accept with me that his common market too would allow free movement of people? It would cost us billions to access the single market. We would be justiciable by the courts. We would be law takers, and we wouldn't be able to do free trade deals. Wasn't that the basic tenet of what we voted for in 2016?
Unfortunately, my honourable friend is only right about some of those things. It is true that in normal days we would be subject to free movement, because that is the price of single market membership. And it is also true that we would have to pay over some financial contributions, though they would be probably of the order of half of what we currently have to pay. He is not right to say that we would be justiciable by the European Court of Justice. Within the European Economic Area, which is what Common Market 2 2.0 proposes, you are subject to the EFTA Court. And the key thing about the EFTA Court is that there is no direct effect in its judgments. They all have to be implemented by sovereign parliaments before they take hold. So it is a substantially different relationship, one in which we would have a great deal more control. And of course, in all of the areas other than the single market, in all of the political areas of the European Union, we would be outside them altogether, and we would truly have taken back control. Now, I won't go away again. Some commentators have criticised those of us who support Common Market 2.0 for adapting our proposal in response to suggestions from other colleagues or to statements by leading figures in the EU and the EFTA states. I make no apology for this. From the start, we have wanted to bring forward a realistic and deliverable plan and give as many people as possible reasons to support it. So since last Wednesday's debate, in response to comments from honourable members on the Labour benches, we have added further detail to the definition of the comprehensive customs arrangement that would prevail at least until alternative arrangements underpinning frictionless trade have been agreed with the EU. We have also added a commitment to seek a protocol on agri-foods trade across the UK-EU border. And I want to thank the Honourable Member for East Antrim and the Honourable Member for East Belfast for educating me about this matter, and for the tireless work of Diane Dodds MEP on behalf of Northern Ireland's farmers. I'm delighted that the Honourable Member for Dundee East felt able to sign the motion on the order paper today. I understand that the SNP plan to vote for Common Market 2.0 tonight. This shows that Common Market 2.0 is the Brexit compromise that would be best for all parts of the UK. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
I thank him very much for giving way. He's very generous. There's one important point that I hope you'll be able to clarify, and that is whether he believes that if his proposal were to go through, it requires a long extension to Article 50, or whether we Brexit on the 22nd of May.
It's a very good question, and I'm very, very pleased that the honourable gentleman has asked it. If this proposal were to achieve a majority tonight, and if the government were to accept it as government policy tomorrow, which they should if this House has resolved on something by majority, then I truly believe that it would not be necessary to extend beyond the 22nd of May. Last week, the EU itself said that they were ready to renegotiate the terms of the political declaration within hours, not weeks. Within hours, not weeks. I give way to my honourable friend.
I thank my honourable friend and for all the work that he's done on Common Market 2.0. Does he not agree that this is not just a strong Brexit, it's actually a unity Brexit, because many Eurosceptics in the past have supported the idea of Britain joining the European Free Trade Area, and current Eurosceptics like my honourable friend Paul Red Ruth and Campbell are supporting Common Market 2.0 membership of the European Free Trade Area. And does he not also agree that there are important breaks on freedom of movement?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend, who's been a very important ally in this cause. And he's absolutely. I'm replying to another intervention. If the honourable lady would just give me one moment. The honourable gentleman, my honourable friend, is absolutely right. Common Market 2.0 has attracted the support of the honourable member for Brigg and Gould, and now no Remainer he. He's been one of the most long-standing and principled Brexiters. Nevertheless, he sees the merits in a proposal which offers something to the 48% who voted Remain, as well as the 52% who voted Leave. And my honourable friend is also right to say that while free movement would apply in normal times, by joining the Common Market 2.0, we would secure a new legal right in exceptional circumstances, and I underline exceptional, to pull an emergency brake on free movement if there were major societal or economic impacts being felt by this country. That is significant. It is not true as a member of the EU, and it is a significant measure of additional control that we do not currently have. I'm happy to give way to the honourable.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, and this is very important because we are all compromising, or should all be compromising, across this House. But does he acknowledge with regards to freedom of movement and immigration that Scotland has a unique demographic situation and that we cannot compromise on freedom of movement because of its importance to the SNP and to Scotland. Will he elaborate further on that point?
And I thank the honourable gentleman for intervening on me. And in truth, I've been educated not just by the honourable member for East Antrim, but also by his colleague for East Dundee and the colleague sitting next to him whose constituency name I don't remember, because I have now understood better the importance of immigration to the Scottish economy, and not just to the economy, to the Scottish society. There is an important detail about the emergency brake in Article 112 and 113 of the EEA agreement, and that is that it talks about regional impacts and the potential for a regional application of the emergency brake that might suspend free movement. So therefore, if it were the case that there were significant societal or economic problems in, say, the south east or the east of England, but not those problems in Scotland, that then a government could bring forward a brake that only applied to the areas affected and did not apply to Scotland. That is entirely within the framework of this emergency brake. Mr. Speaker is glaring at me, so I'm not going to take any more interventions until I've got much closer to the end of my speech. All of us in this House would much prefer to avoid the activation of the Irish backstop. One of the great advantages of Common Market 2.0 is that it keeps all parts of the UK in the single market and in a customs arrangement with a common external tariff until alternative arrangements have been agreed with the EU. So it should be possible to agree with the EU a legally binding joint interpretative statement enshrining the commitment that the backstop protocol will be superseded in full once the UK is safely inside the EEA and a customs arrangement. Common Market 2.0 is the only Brexit compromise that can make the Irish backstop fall away altogether. I'll give way to him.
And for giving way. He's making a very compelling case. I'm almost convinced, but not quite. Could he confirm that what he would do is to replace the Northern Ireland backstop with its potential forever arrangements and handcuffs on the United Kingdom with something that at least we could depart from upon serving sufficient notice?
Thank my honourable friend for intervening. And I simply say this, that we have to have an agreement with the EU about alternative arrangements. But thanks to the hard work of the honourable member, right honourable member for Loughborough and many others across this House, we have secured in the agreement with the EU a commitment to develop those alternative arrangements. And while they may not exist now, and while they may not exist in 3 years' time, I'm absolutely confident that with goodwill we can secure arrangements. I don't believe the EU, any more than we, want to keep us in a prehistoric situation when new technologies make a more sophisticated management of the border possible. Now, many in this House, as we heard from my honourable friend, the member for Hove, many in this House believe that there should be a referendum to secure the voters' consent to any Brexit deal. I don't agree with them, but I have the greatest possible respect for the sincerity of their arguments, and I admire the passionate commitment of the supporters of their cause. I hope, just one second, I hope that, like the right honourable member for North Norfolk, they will support Common Market 2.0. If a referendum happened, its result, we have learned, would be unpredictable. Surely it would be better for the Leave option to be one that retains membership of the single market and a customs arrangement that guarantees frictionless trade.
The honourable gentleman for giving way, and he is to be commended because I think, unlike the government front bench, we are looking now at compromises, working together in the interests of the people. But just to push him a little more on the idea of a referendum, simply, we've already discussed no deal, discussed the Prime Minister's deal, then potentially Common Market
52, not all of those, all of them are mutually exclusive, and they can't all represent all the 52%. Does he not feel that for the interest of democracy and legitimacy, the only way to end this is to put his proposal, with all the benefits that it brings with it, to the British people, allow them to either choose it or to remain?
I thank my honourable friend, and I thank him also for taking the time to talk to me about the proposal and to understand it, and we did discover much common ground. I'm not myself persuaded of that, and I apologise in the sense that I'm not able to be. But what I'm sure he will be aware is that if the House votes for Common Market 2.0 tonight, it will then need to come forward in a withdrawal implementation bill. And there will be opportunities for people across this House to seek to amend that bill and to add the confirmatory referendum that they seek. This is not the last stage in this conversation. If anything, it's just the beginning. And I hope that he can support the leave option that would do least damage to the British economy while continuing to make his argument for a referendum. I'm going to make some progress. Some of my honourable friends on these benches supported the motion laid by the honourable member for Camborne and Redruth, which also supported British membership of the EEA and EFTA. Now, although the journey that Common Market 2.0 proposes might take a little longer, I hope they will recognise that the destination is, to all intents and purposes, the same, and will therefore join my honourable friend in supporting our motion today. Mr. Speaker, constructing a compromise is not easy, nor is the realisation that you may not get everything that you want, that other people's views and interests matter, that it is better to get half a loaf rather than nothing at all. But our constituents do not send us here for an easy ride in which we duck difficult choices. This evening, let us live up to the words of the parliamentary prayer and, setting aside our private interests and prejudices, lead our country out of the Brexit morass.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. Point of order, Mr. Nigel Evans.
Can I thank you, sir, and the authorities here for the way in which this disruption has been handled. A disruption or a distraction, sir, but no disruption to our proceedings. And could we, through you, thank everybody involved?
We want to thank those who look after us and protect us, and I very much appreciate what the honourable gentleman has said. We just press on with the debate. That's what we're here to do. Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the Right Honourable and Learned Gentleman, the Father of the House, the Member for Rushcliffe, and also to follow the Honourable Member for Hove, who's become a good friend during the course of this debacle, and also the Honourable Member for Grantham and Stamford. Given the mess that the present government have got the United Kingdom into, I think each of us who've spoken already today are, in our own way, trying to ensure that the Prime Minister doesn't go naked into the conference chamber, if I may use that phrase, when she goes to the EU Council on the 10th, on the 10th of April, in a week on Wednesday. And as the Father of the House said in his speech, we mustn't allow no deal to happen by accident on the 12th of April, simply because this House has failed to find a deal which a majority can get behind. And as the government's chief whip himself has admitted, the Prime Minister's failure from the beginning, when she lost that general election 2 years ago, to try and build a consensus across this House, with the highly unlikely to find a deal which this House can get behind before Friday the 12th. And therefore, we need some sort of backstop, some sort of insurance policy against a no deal. And we also need a way to make sure that the Prime Minister honours the promise she gave this House at the beginning of last week, that unless this House agrees to it, no deal will not happen. That's what the Prime Minister said. And as we know, and as has been said already this afternoon, one of the things that definitely did happen in the indicative votes last week was that 400 honourable members rejected the idea of a no-deal Brexit. And we know that there's a majority against a no-deal Brexit, and I give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and I commend her for her efforts with this motion before us again today. She will remember, as I do, that the Prime Minister pledged that if Parliament did vote to support no deal, that would become the government's policy. So does she not agree with me that if Parliament votes for her motion tonight, that should be the government's policy? It should be a backstop to make sure that no deal cannot happen.
Yes, I do, and that's the purpose of this motion. And it's not an SNP motion, although I'm absolutely delighted that all my honourable friends are backing it. It's a cross-party motion, and it's been supported by members of every single party in this House, apart from the DUP. And the purpose of the motion is that if we cannot agree a deal by the 10th of April, and everyone must see as a matter of common sense that that's highly unlikely, if we can't agree a deal by the 10th of April, the date of the EU Council, then this motion, if it's passed tonight, would mandate the government to ask, first of all, for an extension of the Article 50 period, and if the EU didn't agree to that, the UK government would require to table a motion immediately asking this House to approve no deal. And my motion goes on to say that assuming the House didn't approve no deal, and I think we can assume that given the many votes that have been in it already, the United Kingdom government would then be mandated to revoke Article 50 before we exit the EU with no deal late on the night of the 12th April. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm extremely grateful. I'm very sympathetic to the idea that we need a backstop in extremis to prevent no deal from happening. But I wondered if she could explain to the House why, beyond that, she went on to introduce that level of complexity that there is later in the motion and such a prescriptive route towards doing that. Is she really wedded to that process, or is she more flexible as to how that might work in the future?
Well, I'm keen to get this motion passed today, and I was very disappointed that some honourable members, particularly in the official opposition, didn't feel able to support it last week. But in the spirit of cross-party working, I am trying to be respectful of the reasons why they didn't feel able to support it, and understand why it's easy for me, coming from the City of Edinburgh, which voted 75% to remain, and the country of Scotland, which voted 62% to remain, and representing a constituency which voted 72% to remain, it's easy for me to cross this bridge, but it's more difficult for members in English and Welsh constituencies with different mandates. And equally, unlike the British Government, who have failed to recognise the fact that Scotland voted Remain and Northern Ireland voted Remain, I am trying to recognise that other parts of these islands voted Leave, and that for some people to support this motion, the door cannot be closed on the Brexit process by a revocation to prevent no deal. And that's why, with the assistance of lawyers, including Joe Mon QC, who was my fellow petitioner when we took the case to the Court of Justice in Luxembourg to establish that Article 50 can be unilaterally revoked. That's why, with him, we've crafted the motion in this way. And in that connection, I declare my interest in relation to the support of the Good Law Project. I'll give way to my fellow sponsor.
Would the honourable and learned lady agree with me that nobody except those who positively want a crash-out, no-deal Brexit, nobody else in this House should have any problems in voting for her motion?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I do agree, and I really do appeal to members across the House, and I know that 10 Conservative members, honourable members, voted for this last week, including 2 junior ministers, and I appeal to anyone who cares about the people who live in these islands and the economy of these islands to prevent a no deal from happening. Absolutely. Now, it's no secret that I came to this House to secure an independent Scotland, and that is still my primary aim. But it is not in the interest of Scotland for the Scottish economy to go down the tube with a no-deal Brexit. It's not in the interest of the English, Welsh and Northern Irish economies to go that way. And it's not in Scotland's interests for the English and Welsh and Northern Irish economies to go that way. And make no mistake about it, Mr Speaker, if we crash out with no deal It will be the jobs of ordinary, decent working people that go first. They're the sort of people who vote for the SNP, they're the sort of people who vote for the Labour Party, and we must protect them. I do give way.
I thank her very much for giving way, and would she also agree that what she is doing today is supported by the 6 million people who signed the revoke petition, a matter which is being debated in Westminster Hall at this very moment?
Yeah. It is, but the difference is, it is indeed, but the difference is that many of the people who signed that petition would like to see us just revoke Article 50 now, straight away, and that would be an end of the matter. I'd quite like to see that myself, but that's not what this motion seeks to do. This motion is about an insurance policy, using revocation as an insurance policy to support a no deal. And in order to, in respectful recognition of the fact that the issue of Brexit won't go away if we simply revoke to avoid no deal, the motion seeks to mandate the government to set up a public inquiry under the Inquiries Act within 3 months of revocation to establish whether a model of a future relationship with the EU could be found which would command a majority support in the United Kingdom. And it also says if that could be done, then another referendum would be held on the question of whether to re-trigger Article 50 and renegotiate that model. Now, I'll give way in a moment, but I just want to knock on the head at this stage a myth that has been peddled by some people that somehow, if this motion were passed, the EU would object to us revoking Article 50. That is not the case, and I think it's a misunderstanding of the judgment of the Court of Justice in Luxembourg in the Scottish case, which did not say that once you revoke Article 50, you can never issue an Article 50 notice ever again. It categorically did not say that. If you can't take that from me, then please read the judgment of the court, which I've put in my Twitter feed this afternoon. I'm going to give way to the honourable gentleman opposite.
Grateful to the honourable learned lady. Would she agree with me that one of the failures of this debate in this House and beyond it is to talk about exactly what no deal is all about, what it actually means for our constituents? We talk about it in too much of a conceptual way, and we let those who actually are in favour of leaving with no deal get away without coming to the real details, whether it's agriculture, whether it's the 83 trade deals which we would be no longer part of.
I absolutely agree. That has been one of the many failures of this process, that this House has not been afforded sufficient time to knock on the head the sort of misinformation peddled about the consequences of no deal. But fortunately, we have much independent research on the consequences of no deal. And you will find, Mr. Speaker, that that independent research wholly tells us that no deal would be bad for the economies of these islands, for jobs and for the living standards of people who live here. It would be to shoot ourselves in the foot and to cut off our nose to spite our face. And I give way to the honourable lady.
That's not right, honourable lady, for giving way. And I'm proud to have signed her motion, and I shall be voting for it tonight. My only concern is not about the motion, but if it's passed, the consequences, because I think, like many of us, right across this House, we are so concerned that whatever votes we come to, ever finds a majority, the government will simply ignore them.
Well, we have every reason to be concerned about that, because as the honourable lady knows, the government have repeatedly ignored votes in this House. However, Mr. Speaker, if an instruction is clear and unequivocal, as this motion is, and it is ignored by the government, there will be political consequences, and we've seen that previously with a contempt motion in this House, and there could also be legal consequences. Now, in any normal times, this government would be long gone because of its incompetence and the multiple fiascos we've had recently. But really, if this government were to ignore an instruction as clear as this and plunge the nations of these islands into the economic disaster of no deal, not only would this government not survive it, but the Conservative and Unionist Party would not survive it. So I'll give way to the honourable lady.
Because I'm looking closely at the motion she's got for the House. Can she confirm, with the timelines that have been outlined in here, that this will indeed absolutely mean voting for this tonight will mean voting again for European elections and having to have MEPs? Absolutely.
We all know that if there's any sort of a lengthy extension, there will have to be European elections. Now, I know there is some learned opinion to the contrary, but I think the weight of opinion is that there will have to be European elections. But if that, I know that's going to be difficult for some people to deal with, but if that is the consequence of preventing no deal and protecting our constituents' livelihoods, the businesses in our constituents and the jobs of our constituents, then so be it. And no responsible MP could really fail to support this motion tonight, even if there are 4 motions before us, and I'm going to vote for two of the other ones. But supporting this motion does not preclude honourable members from supporting other motions. It's not a motion about the eventual outcome. It's a motion about process and a motion about protecting us. Now, I can see the speakers are keen to bring in other speakers, and I'm not going to take up much more time, so I will wind up to a conclusion. But for Conservative members of Parliament, this is an opportunity to make good on the promise that the Prime Minister has already made to this House, that unless the House agrees to it, no deal will not happen. For Labour MPs, it's the opportunity to make good on the promise in their 2017 manifesto, which of course I read, as I always do with Labour manifestos, and which says that Labour recognises that leaving the EU with no deal is the worst possible deal for Britain and that it would do damage to our economy and trade. Labour will reject no deal as a viable option. This is pretty much the last chance saloon, Mr Speaker. And if Labour want to reject no deal as a viable option and put in place the insurance policy of revocation, then they really need to do that today. But most of all, this motion should appeal to all of us as Democrats, because this decision of such importance for the United Kingdom between revocation and no deal ought to be one for the representatives of the people in this Parliament and not for the Prime Minister of a minority government. That's why I've called it the parliamentary supremacy motion. And of course in Scotland it's the people that are sovereign and supreme, not the Parliament. But I recognise that for all intents and purposes this Parliament is supreme, and this motion is all about taking back control and making sure that we have an insurance policy against the dangers that this rather confused government could crash us into a no deal without really meaning to do so.
Order. Approximately 40 honourable and right honourable members wish to speak, the large majority of whom, I'm sorry to say, seem set to be disappointed, and 3 front benchers are due to speak, although I hope mercifully briefly. So, in the interests of trying to accommodate colleagues, we'll start with a time limit of 6 minutes, but it's not obligatory to absorb the full 6. Mr Dominic Reeve.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I will try to be brief. Mr Speaker, there are the 4 motions before us. 2 relate to substance and 2 to process. And I have to say I don't think they can be easily disaggregated. I myself have signed motion E and motion G. Motion E being that of the Honourable Member for Hove, because as I've said on many occasions, I believe that in view of the circumstances that have arisen, the idea that we can legitimately take the people of this country out of the European Union without consulting them as to whether the deal that we are offering them is one they want seems to me to be a very odd thing to do indeed. Because the reality is that everything we've been talking about this evening on the 2 substantive motions particularly bears almost no relationship to what was being advanced by those advocating leave in the 2016 referendum campaign. And equally, this House has said repeatedly that it does not believe in no-deal Brexit, which is why I support the amendment of the Honourable and Learned Lady, the member for Edinburgh South West, because, in my view, we have to do everything to stop it, because the evidence is overwhelming that leaving without a deal would be catastrophic. Now, I realise this is sometimes very difficult. I found myself on Friday night giving an audience the government's own figures on the administrative burden on business of leaving without a deal, which is £13 billion per annum. It may be too high, it might be too low, but it is a reasoned estimate. And finding a group of people, some of the group, who say they support my party and therefore the government, shouting liar at me. And this, I'm afraid, is the point where reasoned debate has wholly evaporated. The House is very clear that what we have here is a real risk to this country's integrity and future, which is why no deal must be prevented. May I then turn to the two substantive motions? Looked at straightforwardly, I think both offer a better destination for this country than what the Prime Minister negotiated. Partly because they both address the Northern Ireland issue and do it in a way that covers the whole of the integrity of the United Kingdom and doesn't separate Northern Ireland out from it, which seems to me to be an advantage. And secondly, because the concessions they make to our participation or deeper integration with our EU partners even after we've left do not come, to my mind, at a cost that I think people will notice when we are out. Because I happen to agree entirely with my right honourable learned friend, the member for Rushcliffe, that in reality the idea of the trade deals that we have celebrated and said that we are going to have, I believe they are going to be absolutely marginal compared to our well-being, compared to what we are going to lose. So for those reasons, I look with favour on both of them, but I do have to say that they are both, as I said a moment ago, very far removed from what was being trumpeted in 2016, which unfortunately was an utterly misleading vision that the United Kingdom could have its cake and eat it, could have the benefits of membership and all the freedoms that go with not being a member. And that is the basic problem this House is going to have to grapple with. Because this evening I will not vote against the two motions, which seem to me to be of substance, which seem to me to be moving us probably in the right direction, but I am anxious about the risks of our concluding a political declaration and moving to a very limited time frame to the 22nd of May with probably no extension, in order to resolve fully the issues within it. To the satisfaction of this House, firstly, I have a serious concern that that can be done, and secondly, to the satisfaction of the public, which is why I do think there is a need for a linkage between the preferred option and consulting the public. Mr. Speaker, I don't want to say any more about this this afternoon. I want to sit down and allow others to speak. But I want to emphasise my willingness to work with members of this House who have promoted both these amendments, my determination to try and bring this sorry saga to an end. But in saying that, I do want to emphasise that I think the House has got to be very careful about simply jumping on something which it thinks we can all agree with, without thinking through the consequences of the process and making sure that that process ends up satisfying the House itself and the electorate and leading to the right outcome.
Dame Margaret Beckett.
Mr. Speaker, I shall seek to be extremely brief because I've been fortunate enough to catch your eye before. One of the merits of last week's indicative vote process was that both the arguments for each option and also the prime concerns have become, I think, much clearer. Discussion on the proposal for a confirmatory ballot, devised by my honourable friends for Hove and for Sedgefield, revealed considerable reluctance to contemplate the longer extension and hence the delay that would be needed. I completely understand that reluctance, especially if, as may be, it would lead to the holding of Euro elections. But to me, this would be a price well worth paying for the sake of achieving the settlement that a confirmatory vote could produce, as it did with the Good Friday agreements. It also may be the price that we need to pay to allow enough scrutiny of the different options that are before us to provide the basis for a stable majority, not just a fleeting majority in this House. And as it happens, I very seriously doubt that such a longer extension can be avoided in any event. The government can only deliver either the Prime Minister's deal or any other deal when the necessary legislation passes both houses in this Parliament. This legislation is said to be ready. But as the Honourable Member for Stafford pointed out last week, the House has seen neither hide nor hair of it. I have heard that it is both long, perhaps even 100 clauses, and that it is also complex. And obviously it is extremely significant part of this process. But whenever it's mentioned, ministers sort of speak just briefly and dismissively, as if its passage is just a given thing. It'll be both brief and uncontentious. I, frankly, Mr. Speaker, rather doubt that. So it seems to me that we're likely to need a long extension anyway for a whole variety of other reasons, so why not take advantage of that reality to hold a confirmatory vote on the likely outcome of Brexit, whatever option ultimately emerges from these deliberations? Yes, of course.
I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way. Right Honourable, very esteemed. Does she agree with me? I agree with what she's saying there. Does she agree with me, though, that in order to get that long extension, the EU would need to be satisfied that this House has actually taken a view for a substantive, positive vote forward? Otherwise, we could just crash out with no deal if we don't take that difficult step.
I do agree that that would make it infinitely easier. I mean, myself, I think that they might be convinced of that on the basis of us wanting to hold such a vote. Absolutely. But I totally accept the point she's making. I think this is all based on the question of, if humanly possible, us trying to get such a deal. Well, I'm trying to be very brief, but all right.
Right, Honourable Lady, for giving way. This country has had half a dozen or so referendums in recent years, and we've honoured the outcome of those referendums on each occasion. But she's suggesting that we don't honour the outcome of the June 2016 referendum. Is the public not entitled, if we don't honour the outcome of that referendum, to ask why should we honour the outcome of the referendum that she is advocating, or any other?
I'm sorry, but I utterly reject the notion that what I'm saying does not honour the outcome of the 2016 referendum. And I'll come to the reason why I don't accept that for 1 second in a moment. It's my view, Mr. Speaker, that we should take the step of a confirmatory vote, whatever the deal or option that is finally agreed, or indeed even if none is agreed, because whatever the honourable gentleman may say, not one of the options before this House tonight or over these weeks was on the ballot paper in 2016. Not one of them, including the Prime Minister's deal.
She's making an excellent speech. I agree with it absolutely. But of course, for a confirmatory referendum to take place, there needs to be a viable leave option on the ballot paper versus remain. Would she agree with me, therefore, that those campaigning for a second referendum should be supporting the other substantive motions that are on the ballot paper this evening in terms of a viable leave option, namely a customs union and common market 2.0?
I am happy to agree with him about that, but I hope it cuts both ways. Because I heard his honourable friend a few moments ago say that, yes, of course, those of you who want a second referendum, you can come back to this some other time in legislation when all of this is done. So a two-way street is certainly... I'm sorry, I really must go on. I know I did refer to you, all right.
I'll be very brief, but I just want to reassure of one thing. Last Wednesday, I abstained on her motion, and I will abstain on it again tonight as a gesture of goodwill towards it.
I'm duly grateful to the honourable gentleman. But what is most often heard in all of these discussions is the argument that somehow to hold a confirmatory vote would be not only wrong but undemocratic. I think that's the point the honourable gentleman was trying to address earlier. And this argument's advanced both by those who believe that the view of the people has not changed and that they will still vote to leave, according to Mr Farage, by a bigger margin, and also by those who fear there's a danger their view might have changed and who resist holding such a vote for that very reason. And it seems to me that there is something mutually contradictory in those arguments. Certainly we've heard a great deal about the resentment which would be felt by those who voted to leave. But I again ask honourable members to carefully consider the position in which this House would place itself if it is the case, and I don't know one way or the other, but suppose that the British people do not now wish to leave the European Union. We are being invited to vote to take the UK out of the European Union, even if it is now against the wishes of the British people, and to do so while refusing to give them the opportunity even to express such wishes. I fear we may find such a refusal difficult to defend, especially if the basis of our discussion ends up being the Prime Minister's deal, which will itself have been presented to this Parliament for decision more than once. There is another dangerous argument being advanced which I shall touch on. We should leave, and if we don't like it, we can always rejoin. This House knows that if we leave, we lose the special opt-outs, the Euro, the Schengen, that successive governments have negotiated. Rejoining will put us in a very different place from remaining with the concessions that we have now. I accept that in a variety of ways, the alternatives proposed on today's order paper by the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Father of the House, or by others, offer advantages over the Prime Minister's proposal. I could live with any of them, apart from the option of no deal. But I repeat, none of them were before the British people 3 years ago, and for that reason, if for no other, they should be asked for their view on the reality that is before them, rather than the fantasies they were spun in 2016.
Hugh Merriman.
It's a pleasure to follow the Right Honourable Lady for Derby South. And like her, I will be voting for motion E, but I will be doing so for very different reasons to the Right Honourable Lady, and it's those reasons I want to pursue here this evening with the time I have. Mr. Speaker, I have been on the wrong side of all of the EU votes when it comes to the arithmetic, with the exception of the vote to trigger, or for the Prime Minister to trigger Article 50, where I was one of the almost 500 MPs that voted for that to occur. And since then, I have voted for the deal, the Prime Minister's deal, 3 times. I have voted for no deal as the fallback twice, and I've also voted to not to allow an extension of Article 50. And on each occasion, I have lost. And that has brought me to this place with regards to this motion right now. This motion, to me, provides the opportunity to get the Prime Minister's deal through, as much as the motion provides the opportunity for those who did not vote for Article 50 to be triggered to revoke Article 50. And I'm very willing to take my chances and put the matter to the people, because I have given up on Parliament delivering a majority for the deal that I want. And so, therefore, I'm left with 2 choices, Mr. Speaker. One is to find myself in meaningful vote 3029, or the other, and I say this as a former transactional lawyer working on a trading floor, the other is to look ahead and actually try and find a solution which will deliver what I want. And what I want is to honour the vote that happened in 2016. It is incredibly important to me. I worry about the democratic deficit of that not being delivered. So, of course, it could be argued, well, why are you going back to the people? But again, I'm going back purely and only, and actually with a great degree of self-loathing to say this. I'm going back purely because Parliament is unable to reach a majority and reach a decision, and we are stuck. And I think every member of this House needs to face up to the reality, ask themselves, how long can this go on? How much uncertainty will we allow business and our constituents to bear before we finally reach the conclusion that we need to find another option? I'll give way.
He talks about uncertainty, but surely a second referendum, in whatever way it's formulated, will just add to uncertainty, ad infinitum. Why would people accept the result of a second people's vote or a second referendum? It's an absurd position.
Absurd, and with respect, it's more absurd us actually having debate after debate, vote after vote, and achieving absolutely nothing, or we can be realistic and say Parliament is not delivering, and that's no disrespect to us as a whole, it's just the reality. And the point back in terms of certainty, this option gives certainty, because unlike, say, for example, a vote for a customs union, which will then have to be negotiated, there are 2 options here. One is revoke, and that can be done. I hope it will not be. The other is the Prime Minister's deal, which has been agreed with the EU. So automatically, these 2 options do deliver certainty, and I would say that the other options don't deliver a certainty, and I would certainly say that Parliament is not delivering anything at all right now. I give way again.
very grateful to my honourable friend. So will he confirm what he appeared to just say, which is that he would have two options on the ballot in a second referendum, one of which would be to revoke Article 50? And is he representing the Chancellor when he says that?
Mr. Speaker, I resent that point, because no, I'm not representing the Chancellor, otherwise I'd be sat right there behind him. I'm representing my constituents and what I feel is right, so I take umbrage with that. And then also, when it comes down to it, again, let's be reasonable. Let's actually look at compromise. Let's look at two differing views. So, as has been put to me, surely it should be on the paper, it would be no deal or deal. Well, of course that's what I want, because those are the options I voted for. But equally, on the other side of the divide, it could be customs union, single market, or revoke. Well, that would be no good for the 17.4 million. So let's just choose one option, which might deliver something for both sides of the argument, and then put it out to people and give certainty. And I absolutely say this not because I've ever wanted a second referendum. As far as I was concerned, when we had the first vote, that was it. I said to my constituents I would follow it. We would go first for the deal. If that didn't work, for no deal. My voting records show that I have done just that. But my voting records, or more the division lobbies, also show that I have lost. And being a serial loser, I can either carry on in that particular negative vein, or I can face reality and tell my constituents that we have to find a way through this. They want that more than anyone I speak to. We have to find a way through this, which is looking for another solution. And that solution, to me, is a confirmatory vote. I give way one last time.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. Would he, further to what he's saying, agree with me that a confirmatory vote would actually also be the best way of healing the divisions, as it would give both sides the chance to have a view on the final deal and to put it to bed once and for all and move forward?
Thank you, Honourable Lady. It may well do, albeit of course it will be fractious, and I will certainly be embarrassed with the very fact that we've got there, but I do so on the basis of the reality of this place. But it's also been put in terms of, well, actually, wouldn't we be better having a general election? But again, I want certainty. A general election is not going to deliver certainty. With all due respect to us all, it might deliver us back again, and we carry on in the same vein that we have so far. And so I don't believe it would, whereas the options that I've laid before the House would give the legal certainty. That would be it. So as far as I'm concerned, Mr. Speaker, I, with great reluctance, say I would absolutely support the confirmatory vote, because to me it's the only way we are going to deliver certainty, and this place, I'm afraid to say, has not done so.
Norman Lamb.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the honourable gentleman, and I agree with the points that he makes. Mr. Speaker, this is the first time I've contributed to any of these debates. I've managed to avoid it until now. But what I have done is to work with right honourable members across this House, and I incidentally pay particular tribute to the right honourable member for West Dorset, the right honourable members for Leeds Central, Normanton, Pontefract and Castleford, and Grantham and Stanford. It's been a pleasure to work with other people who have actually been united in the desire to find a way forward, united also in recognising that there is an absolute need to avoid leaving the EU with no deal. And I believe that it is essential now that we seek to build a consensus. The reason I feel that is for, in fact, two reasons. First of all, we are in a perilous state. There is real danger to this country. There is a high risk that unintentionally we could end up in just a few days' time crashing out of the EU with no deal. Now, the damage to the economy would be profound. The honourable member for somewhere in Birmingham, Erdington, has made the points very well with the right honourable lady, the member for Meriden, about the absolute importance of protecting manufacturing industry and the auto industry in particular. And I also should say that as chair of the Science and Technology Committee, the damage to our science community for crashing out with no deal would be profound. And we have to avoid that, it seems to me, at all costs. But the second reason why I think it's important to build a consensus is that we live now in a horribly divided country with entrenched positions and intransigence on both sides.
And this is deeply damaging, Mr. Speaker, to our country, and we risk damaging the social contract. I think we play with fire if we do not recognise the danger, and I don't think there have been enough people seeking to find ways of bringing this country together again rather than maintaining the divisions. Now, Mr. Speaker, I approach this as someone who voted for and campaigned for Remain. It might be odd to say this, but I also respect the alternative point of view. I have my own criticisms of the EU. I always have done. It is massively over-centralised. I think it needs substantial reform. It needs to be more dynamic and more flexible. And yet, I was clear in my mind that I should support and campaign for Remain. But I lost, and we now need to find a way forward out of this mess. And no route is perfect. No route is risk-free. Danger is everywhere, and I think it's vitally important that today Parliament actually supports a way forward rather than rejecting everything yet again. Another day of everything being defeated risks inflicting further enormous damage on this institution and leading the country feeling that they are without leadership. The country is crying out for leadership. Now, I want this country to agree on a Brexit deal that, as far as possible, protects jobs, protects the economy, the funding also of public services, and maintains the closest possible relationship with the European Union. And then I want that settlement to be put to the people of this country in a confirmatory referendum. Now, the Prime Minister opposes the single market, and she opposes a customs union, and her red lines have stayed rigidly in place all the way through. And she says that she can't support those because they were not in the manifesto. But in 2017, she failed to get a majority. And just as in the coalition, parties coming together had to make compromises. You can't get everything in your manifesto if you don't have a majority in Parliament. It necessitates compromise. And the Chief Whip of the government was absolutely right to say that the election changed everything. Yet the Prime Minister has failed to recognise that, has failed to reach out, and has stuck rigidly to red lines that are inappropriate in a balanced Parliament. So, Mr. Speaker, I will vote to support a customs union. The argument put very succinctly and effectively by the Right Honourable Member for Rushcliffe. Manufacturing industry in our country demands that we remain part of the customs union, and that's why I will support it. It's not sufficient on its own, but it is a building block. I will also support Common Market 2.0. It's not perfect, but it seeks to ensure the closest possible relationship, economic relationship, protecting the economy, protecting jobs. And I would say to the people who support a confirmatory referendum, the motion calls for nothing in this House should be approved without a confirmatory referendum. But we have to agree what this House decides. And please engage in that process, come together, support a deal that protects jobs and the economy, and then put it to the British people.
Brian Spellman.
And it's a pleasure to follow the Right Honourable Member, who was a very good minister in the coalition government. Mr. Speaker, I am very keen that the voice of the world of work should be heard in this debate today. Last week I co-chaired an industrial coalition with my honourable friend the member for Erdington, with a huge range of industries and trade organisations who evaluated the options that are actually before us, and they were going to inform how I will vote this evening. The British brand has been badly damaged, they said. Brexit has changed international perceptions of our country. The CBI and the TUC were very clear that they want Parliament to compromise, to find a way forward. No deal or a Canada-style relationship with Europe would not, in their view, be workable. They warned us that the trade we do with our near neighbours is very different from how we trade with more distant partners. Trading with Canada, for example, could necessitate the completion of up to 12 pages of custom forms, and they estimate that could cost British business an extra $2.5 billion annually. And of course that would hit the hardest, the small and medium-sized enterprises hardest of all. There are big problems, they said, with the mini extensions of Article 50, because business can't properly function on such a short-term planning cycle. The car factories in our constituencies are shut down this month in anticipation of the disruption of Brexit, and the workers have been urged to take their annual leave this month. They can't suddenly open up the factories or shunt that annual leave 3 weeks later. The SMMT would prefer an 18-month to 2-year delay on Article 50 just to give business a chance to adjust. They said we cannot keep marching up to the top of the cliff. The TUC and the CBI again made clear that the threats of a no-deal Brexit, which would put thousands of jobs at risk. I had a go at cooking that yesterday, Mr. Speaker. It's not just jobs, but it is also, I would like to remind the House, the thousands of Brits abroad who won't be able to fund their own healthcare in the event of a no deal and are receiving notice of that now. I've appealed to the government for contingency funding to help these most vulnerable individuals, but again, many extensions don't help them much either. Now, I've consistently supported the Prime Minister's deal. Business says it is workable and will give them clarity, and I'll continue to support that deal if it comes back for another vote. But without enough support in Parliament, we've got to consider the other options. I'll be voting in favour of 2 options. I will support the proposals for a customs union, and there's a big difference in that little word a and the. The withdrawal agreement already provides elements of a customs union, and this is something which both main parties supported in different forms at the last election. Whilst the Conservative manifesto stated we would, quote, no longer be members of the single market or the customs union, we did commit to seek a deep and special partnership, including a comprehensive free trade and customs arrangement, close quotes. I will also vote for proposals setting out common market 2.0, which builds on the EFTA model which my honourable friend, the member for Camborne, put forward. We helped to set up EFTA, and it offers preferential trade with the EU, recourse to an EFTA court for trade disputes, and the right to pull the handbrake on migration. All the options have their critics. However, an agreement on customs with the EU would work for business and help to safeguard jobs. We've got to weigh up. There isn't time to do that, I'm afraid. We must weigh up pros and cons of all the options before us. However, given the large manufacturing footprint in many of our constituencies, the impact on jobs has got to be a key factor. If jobs are lost, no, I will not give way, so that we can have a more flexible trade policy in the future, I would find this way forward very difficult to support. The critical issue for business is the need for frictionless trade with our principal market. Now, I have said 3 times that I won't. For the automotive industry, just-in-time manufacturing is critical. 1,100 lorries a day pass through Dover. And this is the important point. Many firms don't have warehouses to store parts. Their lorries are their warehouses. So any logistic disruption at the border is damaging. Whilst out canvassing in my constituency, Mr. Speaker, a small business owner explained how 15% of his trade is with the EU. This is at risk. If he loses that trade, that's 2 people he has to make redundant. I agree with my right honourable friend that a customs union alone does provide 90% of a solution for a frictionless border. Now, people are understanding on the doorstep, but they do expect Parliament to come together now, across party, and find a compromise. You know, our children's future will depend on the quality of the compromise we seek. We mustn't let them down. These votes tonight will help shape phase 2 of the Brexit process, when we negotiate that future trading relationship. However, we cannot get to phase 2 without phase 1. This means accepting the treaty, which allows us to leave in an orderly fashion, and I urge more colleagues to do this.
Mr. Barry Sherman.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to speak with great pleasure because this has been a good debate, and over the weekend when I was thinking about speaking in this debate, I was lucky to be called. I wanted to be entirely positive. I am indeed a Labour and cooperative member of Parliament. And in my DNA there is a penchant for cooperation, and also there's something between the Right Honourable Gentleman of Rushcliffe and myself. We were both boys born in the Blitz. I was born, I think, a week before him, or 17th of August, on the day after the heaviest blitz of bombing from the Germans of the Second World War, and a week later. My neighbours were, both parents and two little children were killed by a German bomb. And then when I got into Parliament, the generation in 1979 were here. Many of them had fought in that war. Dennis Healy had been on the beach at Anzio. Ted Heath had been in the war. Many of that generation had fought in the war. And they were great pro-Europeans because they'd seen 2 world wars and they knew what it did to Europe. What it did to our economy, to our people, the killing, the wastage, and setting back the European economy for all those years, and political progress seemed the only way forward. And we built, those men and women, built both the United Nations, they built NATO, and they started with the Iron and Steel Community, the European, what began the beginning of Europe. And so I think we should honour them and also put this context, because I speak and intervene in this House a great deal, and I often say I'm sent down from Huddersfield to make sure that people from my town get a better standard of living, greater health, welfare and prosperity. And we can all say that and we all believe it. But putting it in the broader context of the hallowed duty we have never to go back to what was that Europe that was so divisive and bitter. And to hold a sort of olive branch towards the Conservatives, over the weekend I did a lot of history of the Labour Party in Europe. What a mess that is. Now, if you read who was the person who's always canonised in the Labour Party, our leader. Marx. Sorry? Marx. No, not Marx, I'm afraid. Not Marx. But I'll give you another test. He was our first Prime Minister. Do you want to have a try?
Our first Prime Minister? MacDonald.
And second for the majority? Attlee. So Attlee was almost canonised. But any of you want to read about the confusion in the Labour Party over Europe, read Clement Attlee's wanting to reject Europe, and he wanted to continue expanding the trade with the colonies. But if you go through the divisions in the Labour Party on Europe, they are deep and deep inside. They mirror in part what has happened more recently in the Conservative Party. And indeed, it was only Harold Wilson, who comes from Huddersfield, but of course was never the Member of Parliament of Huddersfield, who actually called the first referendum, because he had this deep division between left and right in the party, particularly with Tony Benn. And, of course, the result was we had the innovation that I much regret of bringing referendums into our country and into our constitution. And also I will be supporting all 4 of the amendments this evening, because I think this is the beginning of a process. We are in a bitter and toxic period in our House and in our country. The level of I have all my nearly 40 years in Parliament, I've never seen such nastiness in the street, on social media, in the way we treat each other in the House, the way we refer to each other as traitors, and that sort of language is the worst I've seen in 40 years. And so if tonight we can start the process for voting for some of these positive motions in order to start a process, of course, I want, at the end, to stay in the European Union. I make that very clear, but I am willing to accommodate. I am willing to meet people halfway. I am willing to build bridges. But all the time I have in the back of my mind, what is it for that we need for our country? What is the national interest? Someone at the weekend said, what is the national interest? Prime Minister keeps talking about it. The first Conservative Prime Minister who got us in a message disappeared, and now another one's going to disappear. What is the national interest? The national interest is for this House to come together and replace the vacuum that we've had from the present leadership across the major political parties in our country. And I say that reluctantly, but it's true. A lack of leadership in British politics in the major political parties. It's the time we had it, we had that leadership, and until we get it again, this House has got to pick up the baton and run with it. I hope tonight we'll start that process.
Thank you. Order. I will next take the front bench speeches, and I've asked the Secretary of State and his shadow and the spokesman for the SNP to try not to exceed 5 minutes, and the backbench limit, I'm afraid, will have to be cut to 4 minutes to try to maximise participation. Secretary of State Stephen Barclay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, obviously, I'll take note of that direction. I don't think the honourable and learned friend and I are particularly short of opportunities these days to debate these issues at the dispatch box. And I commend the honourable member for Huddersfield for his honesty, because he did set out clearly that he wishes to stay in the European Union. That is his position. It is the case, however, that the government is committed to ensuring we do deliver on the referendum result. And also, just to pick up, he's not in his place, but the member for North Norfolk spoke both about respecting all views, and I think that's been very much the tenor of the debate today. But if I could just take issue with one point in particular he raised when he criticised the Prime Minister for not compromising. I think part of the criticism she has received from both wings of the debate is that her deal is seen as too much of a compromise for those who want purity on one aspect, a purity of Brexit beyond what all 7.4 million people voted for, and on the other, some who don't want to leave at all. And that is the pincer movement that has bedevilled the agreement she has reached. I will give way, but I am mindful of the Speaker's direction, but of course I will give way.
Those who wanted a pure Brexit and those who didn't want us to leave in any event. Well, I suggest to him that that is not any compromise that the Prime Minister's made. She hasn't compromised, but in any event, the point is she's not reached out to those of us who had accepted the result of the referendum and did want to form a way of delivering on the referendum with the least amount of damage. I think we should...
So, with all due respect to the Right Honourable Lady, the passion and the persistence with which she campaigns for her specific view is perhaps an indication of sometimes the lack of compromise that there is in the wider debate. But it's worth reminding the... well, I've just got 5 minutes, but I'll take one further, and then I think, Mr. Speaker, your steer is I should press on.
I'm sorry to intervene on him. I was going to raise this point in my speech and hope he'd respond, but as he's speaking before me, can he illuminate the House on this letter that has gone to the Prime Minister from 170 of our colleagues? Did he sign it? What's in it? And is it true, as the papers are being briefed, that it keeps no deal on the table despite a resolution of this House?
Well, I think all of us as politicians are often accused of not answering questions, so let's be very specific. I haven't signed any letter of the sort to which he refers. I have the opportunity to meet with the Prime Minister most days, and if I have a point to raise with my right honourable friend, obviously I would do so there. But no, I'm conscious I've got 5 minutes and I also wish to press on. So I think it's worth reminding the House it's only last Friday that members of the... Well, I don't know why the Honourable Lady is chuntering from her position. I have been given a steer from the Chair to give time for other members, and she wants to come in a second time. I have taken her intervention. On Friday, the House voted against the withdrawal agreement, and it's worth pointing out that a number of the motions before the House require the withdrawment as part of the package. Likewise, and that relates to motions C and D, likewise motions before the House relating to a public vote, again, is a public vote on proposals that include the withdrawal agreement, the same withdrawal agreement those members who have signed them have opposed. And the fourth motion before the House includes a vast number of signatories from those who stood on manifestos contrary to what they have signed. So I think, again, it points to the contradictions inherent in the approach that many have taken throughout this debate, because people are taking positions one week and then signing motions which are contrary to that the following week. Well, I've used 4 minutes of my 5, so to very quickly run through. I mean, many of these points, Mr. Speaker, were raised in the debate last Wednesday, including in terms of the permanent customs union, where the concern is giving control over our trade policy, in particular around our trade defences to EU countries over which we would have no say. And I think it is questionable why we would want to give MEPs in other countries control over our trade defences, whether that's in areas like ceramics or steel or many of the issues that are debated in this House. And my right honourable friend, the member for Fulham and Chelsea, has quite often drawn the attention of the House to, I'm pleased to see him in his place, to some of the issues I don't have time to expand on today, but he has done. Likewise, the member for East Antrim reminded the House, when he intervened on the father of the House, in terms of the fact that it is regulatory issues, regulatory alignment, that often drives friction at the border, much more so than the debate which tends to centre on tariffs. In terms of motion D, again, this motion was debated last Wednesday, Mr. Speaker, so we don't need to rehearse the arguments around the financial contributions, the accepting of freedom of movement, the alignment with EU rules, all the things which cause concern. And indeed, the Bank of England, no ardent Brexiteer he, has talked about the damage, how highly undesirable this option is, because of the rule-taking element strangulating a part of our economy that pays £72 billion of tax in 2016-17, and we should be cautious in terms of the rule-taking implications for that. And indeed, in his remarks, the member for Grantham talked about an extension to the 22nd of May. I simply remind my very good friend a point I'm sure he is aware, which is that the conclusions from the Council didn't give an automatic right to an extension to the 22nd of May, given that we passed the deadline of the 29th of March. Again, on the motion E, we debated this last week. Indeed, it was defeated by 27 votes, so the arguments on that were rehearsed. Likewise, in terms of motion D, we debated that. Again, that was to be defeated by 109 votes. So what we have really is a rehashing of a number of arguments that didn't curry favour last week, and again many of the issues remain. A public inquiry under motion G, it's not specified for how long, usually they're for on average 3 years. Are we going to subject our businesses to a further 3 years of uncertainty, followed by potentially a further vote? So what we need to do, Mr. Speaker, is to give a certainty to our business community, to safeguard the rights of EU citizens. That is what the House has rejected in terms of rejecting the deal. It's rejected in terms of the withdrawal agreement. And what we see today is a number of motions signed by people who just last Friday rejected the withdrawal agreement, stood on manifestos which contradict the motion before the House, and in essence are saying today to colleagues across the House, vote for a package which includes a part that they themselves rejected just a matter of days ago.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad we're resuming this indicative vote exercise, and it's been a good debate today. I think it's been a good tone and good contributions from around the House. I do recognise that no majority was found last week for any option, but I equally recognise that Parliament is trying at some speed to complete a process that the Prime Minister should have carried out 2 years ago. Can I just begin by saying a few words to all members across the House, but particularly perhaps to colleagues sitting on the benches behind me. I recognise that many members have a single preferred option and understandably want to push that option as hard and as fast and as far as possible. No one wants to stand in the way of that, but I do urge colleagues to enter the spirit of the exercise we're now engaged in, and that means supporting options other than their own preferred option in order to break the deadlock. It is important that we find a majority, if we can, this evening, if that is possible. I do recognise how difficult that could be for individual members and how they've grappled with the position they've tried to take, but I do ask them to enter it in that spirit and thank them for the approach they've taken so far. So far as the Labour position today is concerned, it will again be to support amendments that are consistent with the two credible options that we've been advancing time and again. In the first place, a close economic relationship with the EU based on a customs union and close single market alignment, and secondly, on a public vote to prevent no deal on a damaging Brexit. I'm going to come on to the customs union in a minute and I will take an intervention. On that basis, we will whip support for Amendment C, which is the customs union as a minimum, in the name of the Father of the House. Amendment D, Common Market 2.0, in the name of the Honourable Member for Grantham and Stamford. And Amendment E on a confirmation public vote in the name of the Honourable Member for Hove, assisted by the Honourable Member for Sedgefield. I will come to Amendment G in one moment. So far as Amendment C is concerned, Labour has long supported a customs union. It is a vital component of any deal that will genuinely protect manufacturing, and it is necessary to protect against a hard border in Northern Ireland. But I say again, as I said last week, it must be a minimum, and that is written into this amendment in terms, and that is the position of the Labour Party. I will give way.
Thank you for giving way. Perhaps he could, on the subject of the customs union, just to take him back a few years, and the Labour Party was wholly opposed to TTIP. I think it was before he was in the House, but nevertheless, at a time when the UK had a seat at the table, now as he's proposing it, the UK would not have a seat at the table. The EU would set our trade policy. Why is he in favour of this arrangement, particularly at a time when the United States says they want to launch trade talks with the European Union? The EU, of course, in general, has got a system of social insurance, not our system for the NHS. How does he think this is a better arrangement to defend his NHS?
Well, I'm grateful for that intervention. It's a serious point, and before the Labour Party surfaced its proposition for a customs union, we had long and hard discussions with the EU about the sort of customs union that we were discussing. Not the customs union, but a customs union, and we looked at the influence that now is there for EU members and how you would devise a pillar that gave influence to a very close third party. I've stood here many times said that won't be easy, but that's why we've always said a customs union with a say, and it's not something we haven't sought to discuss with the EU, and it's very telling that when we put our proposal to the Prime Minister, the EU were very warm about the possibility of negotiating that. I take the point, but we've addressed that, I hope, in the way that we've approached a customs union. Mr Speaker, Amendment D, Labour's preference remains the approach we set out in the letter to the Prime Minister in January of this year. That is a customs union and single market alignment. But we recognise that Amendment D has a number of similarities and could deliver a close economic relationship with the EU. The amendment has been revised since the first phase of indicative votes and now includes further detail about the form of a customs arrangements envisaged, which has similarities with the approach that the Labour Party has set out. It doesn't specify that it should be permanent, which is our preferred option, but it does say that it should be at least until alternative arrangements can be found. Now, there do remain differences between our policy position and Amendment D, but the amendment would allow for close economic partnership with the EU. It is a credible proposition, and it's on that basis that we will support it this evening. I won't, because I'm trying to make some progress. Mr Speaker, as far as Amendment E is concerned, we will support this amendment tonight because at this late stage it's now clear that any Brexit deal agreed in this Parliament will need further democratic approval. That is what this amendment will do. It would put a lock around any deal this Prime Minister forces through at the 11th hour, or any revised deal that comes about at this very late stage. It would ensure that any Tory Brexit deal is subject to a referendum lock. In other words, it upholds the principle that any such deal must be confirmed by the public if we're to proceed. I do want to briefly finish by dealing with Amendment G, because I do understand the reason this is put forward, and I've had the opportunity to discuss it with the honourable and learned member for Edinburgh and the South West. Our focus today is on the way forward, which is why we're supporting the three amendments in place. G, in a sense, is a fallback if that exercise fails, and I do therefore understand why it's put forward. We won't be voting in favour of it tonight, but we do accept that this is an issue that is going to have to be confronted by this House in due course. And I will give way on that point.
I'm really extremely puzzled as to the position taken by the Labour front bench here. We all have to compromise today. I'm going to vote for motion D, and I'm on the record as having concerns about it and saying it didn't go far enough. What does he think the reaction will be of working-class voters if, by Labour front bench's failure to support this motion tonight, we crash out with no deal a week on Friday?
I'm grateful for the intervention. I think as we try to find a way forward, it's important that we all adopt the right tone all the way through, and sort of throwing around what will people think of this, that and the other. We, of course, have always said we will take whatever measures are necessary to stop no deal. The exercise we're involved in at the moment is trying to break the impasse and find a way through on the indicative process. I accept if that fails, there will have to be an insurance exercise, but we're not at that stage yet. I'm not rejecting the principle. I'm not going to take another intervention, but I'm not going to stand at this dispatch box and have across the House the throwing around of allegations that you're not interested in that, you're not interested in the other. We are trying to have a different debate with a different tone, which is in a grown-up way to find a way forward. And I'm prepared to engage in that. I'm prepared to accept that the principle is one we're going to have to confront. But at the moment, our focus is on how do we break the deadlock. And if we can do that, we then move on to how we progress. If we can't, then of course we have to look at other options. That's a genuine, sincere position from someone who cares a great deal about whether we crash out without a deal. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Ed Vasey.
I'm very grateful, Mr. Speaker, and I just, I want to start with the usual mantra that, of course, I have voted for Brexit 3 times, and I have backed the Prime Minister's withdrawal agreement, but I will be supporting the Customs Union and Common Market 2.0 tonight, and I want to make it absolutely clear to anyone thinking of not supporting it that this does not preclude you supporting the withdrawal agreement should it come back as MV4. But it is quite clear that we need a plan B. The House needs to show what it is in favour of if we can't get the withdrawal agreement through. And the reason is because certain elements, sadly in my party, are hell-bent on shoving through a no deal. I read on the cover of the Times, and I apologise to the Secretary of State for putting him in the same category, this morning that 170 Conservative MPs have signed a letter to the Prime Minister, which they've kept secret from all their other colleagues, by the way, so keen are they on debate, calling for a no deal, despite Parliament's resolution. So Parliament has to vote tonight to support these measures, to show that it remains in favour of a reasoned exit from the EU, and not to be taken in by some of the absurd arguments that we are hearing. I have to say I am confused as to how we have got to this place 3 years after the referendum, where no deal turns out to be allegedly what people voted for. And I look aghast at some colleagues who I have long admired, who have spent the last 3 years attacking the judges for daring to suggest that Parliament might have a vote on Article 50, praying in aid the manifesto which we lost on, despite having supported a coalition government for 5 years which campaigned on a manifesto that hadn't existed in 2010, berating Remainers for treating with foreign powers and then merrily going off to the Polish and Hungarian governments asking them to force a no deal on the United Kingdom. Because the fact is that too many of our colleagues have decided that they are the self-appointed interpreters of Brexit, and that anything that gets in their way has to be stopped. But when those of us in this House, and I count almost everyone in the chamber this evening, want to make reasonable progress and deliver Brexit in a reasonable way, the constitutional experts from the hard Brexit wing emerge to tell us that this is the biggest constitutional outrage, oblivious to the fact that one of their colleagues has called for the prorogation of Parliament to get through a hard Brexit, and has also called for a no-confidence vote in the government from which he still takes the whip. The fact is that we are seeking a compromise. I voted for the withdrawal agreement. It's been supported by Gove, Leadsom, Fox, Grayling, Lee, all people whose Brexit credentials cannot be second-guessed. For those who worry about the manifesto, it accords with the manifesto. But if we can't have the withdrawal agreement, we need a reasonable way to leave the European Union and deliver on Brexit. If you look at what the Brexiteers said during the Leave campaign, Norway was on the table, Switzerland was on the table, EFTA was on the table. This House wants to leave with a deal, but if we don't show tonight that we're in favour of a deal, I can guarantee you my colleagues will do their level best in the next 2 weeks to drive through a hard, no-deal Brexit.
Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My remarks will be very brief tonight, and I'll be just explaining why Plaid Cymru will be supporting only one option and two procedures as we see potential solutions to this Brexit deadlock. The Prime Minister is insisting on bringing forward the same votes on her botched deal, only for the House, I think, to reject it again, as has happened twice already. So we believe it is essential to hold the people's vote on the final deal. Ultimately, it must be a question of deciding between the arrangements that we know and which have worked well, though not perfectly, for several decades, and what those advocating change can devise. As it is clear, there is no agreement on what that alternative might be, but what was started by a vote of the people must, I think, be ended by a vote by the people. So we will be supporting the motion in the name of the Honourable Member for Hove tonight. The best option for Wales is undoubtedly to remain within the European Union, with our economy heavily dependent on being able to export tariff-free to the European Union. Leaving that union would be damaging for the Welsh economy, and it is our responsibility as Plaid Cymru, the party of Wales, to mitigate this as much as we can, as much as is possible. Therefore, we will also be supporting the motion in the name of the member for Grantham and Stamford, which would continue to ensure membership of the single market and a form of customs union, protecting jobs, protecting workers' rights and protecting our economy. It is indeed strikingly similar to proposals entitled Securing Wales's Future, which we brought forward some 2 years ago, largely the fine work of our late friend Steffan Lewis AM, whose untimely death this year deprived us of a great future prospect for our politics. As I said, if this is the final position adopted, it is imperative that this too is put to a people's vote. It is essential that we have a means of protection against crashing out of the European Union with no deal at all. The first step to protect against this must be a meaningful extension of Article 50. This has to be obtained from the European Union, but were this to be refused, and I think that is unlikely, it must be up to this House to choose between no-deal Brexit, which we have already rejected, and revoking Article 50 and stopping this careering train in its tracks. Therefore, we will be supporting the amendments in the name of my friend, the Honourable and Learned Member for Edinburgh South West. Thank you.
Thank you. Last speech at 4 minutes. Greg Hands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm starting off by answering my right honourable friend, the member for Rushcliffe, I think, who said he hadn't heard a single argument against a customs union. But I give him credit for staying for the whole debate, because I'm going to give him plenty. He mentioned that, Mr. Speaker, I've been involved in a filibuster, and I counted my contribution on the Business of the House motion at 1 minute 13 seconds. Now, Mr. Speaker, that must be perhaps the shortest filibuster there's ever been. I did once speak for 1 hour 43 minutes on beer duty, but I think 1 minute 13 doesn't really count. So why, Mr. Speaker, is a customs union a very bad idea? Broadly speaking, huge loss of control over our own economic policy, a decline on our foreign policy influence, and a huge democratic deficit. Trade policy, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is not just about trade deals. It is about much more that we would be handing over to the European Union without a seat at the table. There's tariffs, there is remedies, there is preferences, as well as trade agreements. All of this, Mr. Speaker, would be given over. The House of Commons would abrogate its responsibility in relation to the UK's trade policy. And this is not Andorra or San Marino, which are in customs unions at the moment with the European Union. This is the world's 5th largest economy. Now, he and I were on the same side in the referendum in 2016, so I'm not approaching this as some kind of Brexiteer. I'm approaching this, Mr. Speaker, as what makes sense for the UK for our trade policy. And it makes no sense in our democracy for this House of Commons tonight to vote to hand over control of UK trade policy to Brussels. That would mean that a Maltese commissioner, a Latvian MEP, a Portuguese commissioner, a Slovene MEP, they would all have more say over UK trade policy than any elected UK politician. That would include the UK Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker. They would have more say over it. That is not democratically sustainable. Nor is it sustainable for our foreign policy. He and I served in government together. And I went into various rooms, Mr. Speaker, in foreign countries, speaking to foreign governments. And trade is one of the aspects of leverage that you have. When we're members of the European Union, that will mean the UK's influence on EU trade policy. That is obviously going to be gone, but we'll have no influence over our own trade policy. We will be unable to have those conversations with the government of the United States and say, well, actually, if we can do this on some other area, we will have a word in Brussels on this particular trade issue. All of that will be good. Well, I'm not, because unlike my right honourable friend, I'll take an extra minute, yes.
I get you an extra minute, yeah. I'm very grateful, because I didn't have time to give way to him. But to say the British government, if we moved into a customs union, would have as little influence over deals being negotiated by the EU as a Latvian MP, I think you'll acknowledge, is a slight exaggeration. And as the spokesman for the opposition has said, a big economy like ours would add to the attractions of the EU market with a negotiating partner. We surely could put in place a structure giving us far more consultation, far more involvement in the negotiations than he is describing. Not as good as now, but perfectly adequate.
I think on his part, I have to say, I think that is wishful thinking. The European Union is highly likely to prioritise the interests of its members versus the interests of the non-members. That has always been the case. Also, there's serious arguments as to whether European Union rules would even allow a non-member to be of influence on EU trade policy. I'm afraid that is just a fact. So, Mr. Speaker, democratically unsustainable. On tariffs, we've got a position, Mr. Speaker, where tariffs will be set by people who are not accountable to this House or to our constituents. That could be very damaging. It could be damaging on goods coming into the country, where they set high tariffs on goods that our consumers would quite like to get access to. Or it could happen the other way round, with things like trade remedies, Mr. Speaker, which is briefly mentioned. Incredibly important. Trade defences. All of this would be handed over to Brussels. Now, Brussels might look after our trade remedies, but they would not give it priority. They would give the defence of their own industries, the fee-paying members of the European Union, the priority over countries like ours. So those all-important WTO investigations into, say, the UK ceramics industry, those would be relegated below investigations to protect, say, the German or Dutch steel industries. Mr. Speaker, on trade deals, you've got the case, the Turkey trap it is talked about. This is the asymmetry. The EU would offer access to our 65 million consumers without being able to achieve necessarily anything in return. And you can guarantee it that the UK asks would be the ones that will be dropped first, and the UK items of defence would be the ones the EU would concede first. That is inevitable, because we would not be a fee-paying member of the European Union. We would not be a priority for them. I'll give way, yes.
Saved him from the clock. I'm listening very carefully to my other friend, and I have a lot of respect for him, and I have read his article, and I've listened to every speech so far during today's debate. I understand what he doesn't want, which is the customs union. But bearing in mind that Parliament has yet to decide what it does, has rejected all other options, and the Prime Minister's withdrawal agreement and political declaration, what is he arguing for?
I continue to argue, Mr. Speaker, for the Prime Minister's agreement. And that is where I think that we should head. I think that is the best compromise. People talk about a compromise. That is the best compromise that he and I have both voted for. Mr. Speaker, on a couple of other points in relation to trade agreements, I was astonished that the Labour front bench is supporting this idea of handing over our trade policy. They were the people most passionately against TTIP and other trade agreements due to the access it would supposedly have given foreign companies to the NHS. As it happens, Mr. Speaker, I don't buy into that idea. But the idea that now it's going to be fine because we're handing over trade policy to the EU, but we don't have a seat at the table, that, I'm afraid, is for the birds. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I think in terms of trade policy, I think it was Senator Elizabeth Warren who said, if you don't have a seat at the table, you're likely to be on the menu. And that is exactly what I fear will happen in an EU customs union if option C is passed this evening.
Thank you very much. Stephen Gethin.
Mr. Speaker, I think it has been a good debate, and I'd like to pay tribute to members, not least the member for Dorset West, in terms of his innovation, and other members in the way in which they have engaged in this process. But let's be clear in all this. Every day I am more and more pleased that Scots voted overwhelmingly to remain in the EU. We could have walked away from all of this, washed our hands of it, and said it was nothing to do with us. But we must engage, and we have done every single step of this sad, sorry process. Mr. Speaker, there are no winners from this tragedy of epic proportions. This is a horror show, and this is all about us trying to make things less bad rather than better.
Absolutely.
But one thing that has come out of this is that this is a government that seems to be uniquely bad at minority government and uniquely bad at reaching out to other parties, and this process is forcing us to talk to each other in a more meaningful way. Now, the SNP did not vote for an EU referendum. We did not vote to trigger Article 50, and we can see why. I'm pro-European. It's a force for good that's made us wealthier, safer, greener and fairer. I'm somebody who has benefited from our membership, from freedom of movement, Erasmus and the privileges and rights that we have as European citizens. But we have to engage in what you, Mr. Speaker, were right to call part of a process. So in terms of the first, can I first of all congratulate my honourable and learned friend, the member for Edinburgh South West, for her proposal. It is a responsible proposal. And frankly, I think anybody who is opposing this tonight is being irresponsible. No deal is a dangerous Brexit. It is a damaging Brexit, and for those who call it a clean Brexit, I say this: it is the messiest Brexit possible. But this is also the best option, the reason we will back it. It is the amendment to revoke Article 50 as the reset clause. And frankly, I'm astonished that the Labour Party haven't been able to support this tonight. Absolutely. And I have to say that disappointed is the least possible I can say on that. We're also in favour of a people's vote, and I'd like to support the member for Hove. And as somebody who wants to campaign to remain in the EU, I would look forward to doing so. Can I just make reference to the for the member for Grantham and Stamford and pay tribute to the way that he has engaged with us in this process? I hope he doesn't mind me saying that I want to remain in the EU, he wants to leave. We disagree profoundly on many issues, but the way in which he's tried to engage with us, I was very, very grateful for, and I know my honourable friends were very, very grateful for the way that he's conducted this as well. We'd like to see a referendum. I also think a long extension is the right way to take these things forward as well. But in particular reference to his reassurances around freedom of movement and the particular situation in which Scotland finds itself has been incredibly important to us, and I would like to acknowledge that. That's not a wholehearted endorsement, and as he rightly pointed out, there will be a time further down the line, hopefully, when there are amendments and other purposes to that as well. But, Mr. Speaker, we can no longer be held hostage by a small band of Tory extremists on this. Now, this is not the end of the line today. This is not the end of the line. I would appeal that members support the motion in the name of my honourable friend, the member for Edinburgh South West. But in conclusion, we must find a way forward. We should rightly be debating poverty, climate change, austerity. Instead, we are focused on the least worst options and damage limitation. We shouldn't be doing that. And it's time for us to put this Brexit nightmare behind us.
George Eustace.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For some time I favoured
Honourable gentleman's pardon. My apologies to the honourable gentleman. A 3-minute limit now applies, as the honourable gentleman was advised earlier. George Eustace.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For some time, I favoured a simpler and swifter Brexit, based on us leaving the European Union but rejoining the European Free Trade Association, and in so doing, making our existing rights and obligations as a signatory to the treaty establishing the EEA operable. It would mean that we would have no customs union, would have an independent trade policy, would be outside the CFP, outside the CAP, but would accept regulatory alignment to reduce border friction. My particular amendment, Mr. Speaker, was not selected, but I can say that this evening I will now support motion D, in the name of my honourable friend, the member for Grantham and Stamford, the so-called Common Market 2.0 option, for reasons I will come on to. But, Mr. Speaker, there were two ways of addressing this issue of Brexit. One was to self-confidently resolve from the beginning that we would leave as a third country and prepare on that basis and be willing to leave without an agreement if necessary, and I would have supported the Prime Minister in that had she seen that through. But if it was the case that the Cabinet always believed that we could not leave without a deal, then they had to recognise that that would require significant compromise with the EU, which in turn would require the development of a cross-party consensus in this House. Now that the Prime Minister and her Cabinet have signalled that they are unwilling to leave under a no-deal scenario, we must try to secure a consensus. Last Friday, the Prime Minister's withdrawal agreement was defeated for a third time, but the vast majority of members on this side of the House voted for the withdrawal agreement, albeit unenthusiastically in many cases. And my contention this evening is that those honourable members who were willing to take a second look at the withdrawal agreement should also take a second look at Common Market 2.0. Because certainly it envisages a temporary customs union, but so does the withdrawal agreement. First through the implementation period, then through a probable extension to the implementation period, then finally through the backstop. The motion also envisages some regulatory alignment through membership of EFTA and the EEA. But this would be dealt with expeditiously under this motion. Under the withdrawal agreement, the UK is already committed to align its regulations in relevant areas, and the extent to which we have border checks would be dependent on any divergence from that. So, in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I believe that this option does provide a way to compromise, a way forward for this House. I believe it's far preferable to option C, motion C, the proposal for a customs union, which, as honourable members have pointed out, doesn't make sense for an independent country such as this. It means that we would have our commercial interests traded away in terms of getting interest for other countries, and it wouldn't solve the border issues.
Thank you. Ben Bradshaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While the headlines that greeted last week's indicative votes about a shambles and chaos were painfully ridiculous, given it was the first time we were given the opportunity to discuss these after 2.5 years of the government failing to get a consensus, I do think it would be helpful if we made progress today, and that, as other members have said, is going to involve all of us, not just sticking to our first preference, but voting for our second preference, and indeed any preference that we can live with. And that's certainly something I shall be doing. I shall be supporting Labour's unanimously agreed conference policy in favour of a public vote, and I am also minded to support the motion in the name of the Father of the House. But I do, and other members do, have concern about this and about the length of the extension, because what I do not want to happen is for the Prime Minister to pocket this, add it to her political declaration and take us out of the European Union on May the 22nd. I don't think that would be acceptable. I have similar concerns about the motion in the name of the honourable member for Grantham. It's better, it takes away all the stuff about the free movement of labour, but it still only has a temporary customs union, and it still could be bagged by the Prime Minister, added to the political declaration, and will be out within a few weeks. I give way to the Right Honourable Member.
Very grateful to the Right Honourable Member, but I hope you'll recognise that actually the only way in which the government can carry this forward, if there is a cross-party consensus, is to bring in something like the Withdrawal Act Implementation Bill, which gives his party the opportunity to seek to amend it, no doubt with much support around the House, in order to prevent the eventualities he's talking about.
I very much hope that he is right, and I do take his point on that. The other point I wanted to make was absolutely to agree with my right honourable member, the member for Derby.
My view is that if we get progress today, and if we get a majority on one or more of these options, basing the future of our country on a majority that has been agreed in Parliament among members of Parliament for whom it might not have been their first but might have been their second or third preferences, will not only lack long-term legitimacy, but it will also lack sustainability. It will be impossible for us as a House or for any government to take this forward without it being ratified in a confirmatory vote by the British public. And that's why I think whatever happens tonight, we are going to have to accept the principle that the Brexit that is now on offer is so different from the Brexit that was offered in 2016 that it would be undemocratic and unlegitimate not to give the people a final say on it. And I want to say one last thing about the motion in the name of the honourable and learned member for Edinburgh South West. I will be supporting this motion, and as I said earlier, I cannot see any reason for anybody, unless those who actively want a no-deal Brexit, not to support this motion tonight. I'd hoped our front bench might support it. I hope it will on Wednesday if it comes to that. But we have to have an insurance policy against a no-deal, crash-out Brexit. More than 6 million members of our community are demanding it, and I would urge all honourable members on both sides of this House, it's only a recommendation on our side, to vote for this and to do so with enthusiasm.
John Stevenson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will be short and to the point. Let's go back to first principles. What was the referendum question about? It was about our membership of the EU. This country decided to revoke that membership, and therefore we must implement that decision. By doing so, we effectively become a sovereign, independent nation. Any sovereign, independent nation gets involved in international relations. We do through our membership of NATO, which has obligations and benefits. We are also members of the United Nations, which has responsibilities and also clear benefits. And interestingly, we also make a financial contribution. So as an independent sovereign nation, we will clearly want to enter into free trade agreements. Logic would dictate that we should start with the 30th closest countries which are in Europe, and they are our main trading partners, 55% of our trade. Any agreement we would want, no tariffs, we would want regulatory alignment, a market of 500 million people, some of the richest in the world. We would like agriculture and fisheries to be excluded, and we want to make sure that there was a fair competition policy and state aid rules to be fair to all the participants. What a wonderful opportunity for our businesses, some real benefits for our country. But clearly there may be some obligations, quite rightly there should be. What about payments, contributions? Quite rightly we would make contributions to the actual institutions, we might even make contributions to poorer regions to help them develop. But there would be a very significant saving from the amount we pay in relation to our present arrangements. What about free movement? Yes, we have to accept that there might be free movement, but that's something we may in fact want, because we need employees for our NHS, we want workers during the summer, we want the opportunity to tap into that sort of employment base that is in Europe. But under this agreement, we would also have an emergency brake, so if circumstances were such that we wanted to curtail immigration, we would be in a position to do so. What about changing the rules? Quite clearly, under any agreement, there would have to be the ability to change rules, and we'd have to accept them. However, we could be right in at the beginning, helping to frame those rules and make sure that they were ones that we could tolerate. But interesting, as an independent sovereign nation, the only way those rules could be implemented would be through an Act of Parliament in this House. No other body could impose those rules upon us. But what if any of this is ultimately unacceptable to us? We might just say we're not going to enact those policies because we are a sovereign parliament and we're not willing to do so. We might enter into a negotiation with those countries and try and see if we can come to some arrangement, or as an independent country we could give 1 year's notice and leave. Mr. Speaker, this is quite clearly, in my view, the best possible outcome. It confirms our revocation of our membership of the EU, but we'd be part of what I consider the best free trade arrangement that there is.
Whilst many have lauded this exercise today, I think that we've got to bear in mind that we are having a hurried discussion about a wide range of solutions when this House at one stage even claimed that the 5 days and all of the committee scrutiny and all of the questions and all of the statements which there was to be in place of the government's proposal was not enough. And yet here we are today, and of course people would say, well, it's not their fault, it's the government's fault, but nevertheless, let's not pretend that we're going to reach a conclusion on the issues before us today with having taken any significant debate on the issue or having scrutinised the issues. As far as the DUP are concerned, we look at all of the options before us on 2 grounds. First of all, do they deal with the toxic issue of the backstop? And secondly, will they deliver on what people voted for in the referendum? And I've got to say, when I look at the options which are before us, and we've already had the exchanges in the customs union, the customs union option would still not deal in EU terms, and the terms which they have led the issues out in the withdrawal agreement would not deal with the EU's objections to the problems along the Irish border. And as far as the proposal in the name of the member for Grantham and Stamford, that equally would not deal with the issue, because, of course, since there is uncertainty about what the future would be in relation to whether we'd stay fully in the single market or whatever, the EU have made it quite clear that where there is uncertainty, they will require that the backstop be in place. And indeed, the withdrawal agreement makes it clear that even if the backstop were to be removed, it could be in all or in part, depending on how they judged what the settlement would be. I will give way, yes, I will give way.
I'm very, very grateful. Does he also recall that actually being in a customs union is not a frictionless state? It would require physical movement certificates on every consignment. There'd be export declarations, import VAT, up to 200 million transactions per annum. That's not frictionless trade.
For those reasons, it does not. The solutions before us tonight do not deal with the backstop. Now, some people would say, well, of course, there is no solution other than staying in the EU that deals with the backstop. I don't accept that. And I don't accept it because, first of all, of current practice, and secondly, because of what the EU have said themselves about what would happen in the case of no deal, where they have argued that they do not need to have barriers along the border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic.
I think I agree with him that in addition to a customs union, you probably need some small regulation, some modest regulatory alignments, so the open borders existed in Ireland and at Dover. But the regulatory alignment would be the same for the whole of the United Kingdom. And I thought that the DUP's objection to the backstop was it put in place different arrangements for Northern Ireland from the rest of UK, putting a barrier down the Irish Sea. Motion C avoids that.
I said there were two criteria. First of all, did it deal with the issue of difference between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom? And secondly, would it deliver on what people voted for when they voted to leave the EU? And of course, if we stay in the customs union or a customs union arrangement, if we stay with the degree of regulatory alignment which is required, then of course that would not deliver on what people have voted for. And could just maybe deal with the amendment regarding the confirmatory public vote. And the option which is emerging here today would be we would put a deal to the people, probably a deal to the people of the United Kingdom based on whatever compromise solution came from this Remain Parliament, or we would vote to remain. Now that, quite frankly, is not a choice. That is not the choice that people, the vast majority of people who voted to leave the EU is concerned. Remain or half remain. People voted the first time to leave. And therefore, even the idea that somehow or other we're giving people a choice is would not be acceptable. And as far as the Scottish National Amendment is concerned, well, I think that it's clearly simply an attempt because they've made no secret of where they stand on this, that they wish to stay in the EU. They wish to ensure that that situation is provided for, and for those reasons we would not vote for that amendment either. So tonight we will not be supporting any of these arrangements. One, because they do not safeguard the issue of the Union, and two, because they do not deliver on Brexit.
Alphon, Common Market 2.0 is a strong Brexit, a workers' Brexit, a no backstop Brexit, and a Eurosceptic Brexit. We'd be out of the political union, out of the common fisheries policy, out of the farming policy, out of home affairs and taxation. We'd leave the jurisdiction of the ECJ and regain our sovereignty and take back control. And we would not be rule takers. Sitting on the EEA Joint Committee, we can delay, adapt or derogate from any single market law or directive. EFTA states have secured over 1,100 derogations and adaptations. Norway and Iceland alone have derogated from EU law on more than 400 occasions between them. We'd have much greater involvement in the law-making process, with the right to be consulted on any new EU single market law. Of course.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way, and I'd like to congratulate him and his colleagues for the intelligent work that they've done on promoting Common Market 2.0, and to other right honourable members for the debate today and the sensible compromises which have been brought forward. Would he agree with me, Mr. Speaker, if you'll just bear with me, would he agree with me that it would be much better for all concerned if this was properly discussed by this House 2 years ago to help shape our negotiations with the EU?
Well, my honourable friend is right, and of course hindsight is a wonderful thing. Now, furthermore, under Common Market 2.0, the UK would regain its seat at global bodies such as the WTO, so we'd be able to shape the global standards that are the basis for many EU and EEA laws. And as an EFTA member, we take back some control over immigration. Article 12 of the EEA agreement gives us important safeguards that would allow Britain to unilaterally take appropriate measures. And Article 28.3 would allow us to apply brakes on grounds of public policy, security or health. And we'd be able to do our own trade deals outside of the EU. EFTA states have 27 deals with 43 other countries. But at the same time, Common Market 2.0 is a workers' Brexit, because we keep the high standards workers' rights on annual leave, equal pay, maternity and parental leave and many other things. And we'd be aligned to the single market, safeguarding our economy, our businesses and our jobs. It's a no backstop Brexit, because Common Market 2.0 can be negotiated before the end of the transition period, meaning the backstop would never need to be activated. And the former president of the EFTA court, Karl Baudenbacher, stated in an interview that Norway-style deal could solve our issues around the backstop. There's also no backstop because we would mirror customs or union arrangements until the frictionless border is solved. But it's a unifying Brexit. Common Market 2.0 brings together the support of Remainers and Leavers across the parties, from the Honourable Member for Cambourne to the Member for Briggan-Gall to the members from Manchester Central and Aberystwyth. King's College London University report about changing attitudes to Brexit shows that the most popular option is a Norway-style deal, and it's gaining traction. Since 2017, support for EFTA has increased to 43%, and among Leave voters, 34% opted for EEA option in 2018, up from 24% in 2017. It's been supported in the past by many principled Eurosceptics. I won't give way because there's a lot of others who need to speak. Just in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, the government said last week that we leave the European Economic Area automatically when we leave the EU. Yet in a January 2017 application for a judicial review of exactly this issue, the government conceded in court at paragraph 16D of its legal submission that the legal position argued by the applicant, Mr. Adrian Yallen, that we do not leave the EEA automatically, but by giving an Article 127 notice was in fact correct. And the government's legal submission states, for the avoidance of doubt, the Secretary does not rely on Article 126 as giving rise to the termination of the EEA agreement. So this is an agreement that can, Common Market 2.0 is a Brexit that can unite the Conservative Party, unite the country, unite Parliament. It's a Brexit that is for everyone.
A 2-minute limit now, please. Lucy Powell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow my friend, the member for Halfon. He and I actually come at this. Halfon, sorry. He and I come at this from very different perspectives. I represent a constituency that voted Remain, and I campaigned for Remain, but we have reached some of the same conclusions, although we come at it from a very different place. And I think that's what today is about. It is about that spirit of compromise, that spirit of trade-off, and that spirit of working out what it is that each of us can actually live with, not what we would prefer, our preferred option. I'm going to vote for all the options on the table today, even though I'm sceptical about some of them. Because my biggest fear, Mr. Speaker, my absolute biggest fear at this stage is that we are going to be heading for no-deal Brexit on the 12th of April unless this House can come to a view about something that it is for. Ideally more than one thing, but at least something that it is for. And I think it's highly unlikely that the EU would give us a longer extension or would even contemplate that if we are still locked in this indecision vortex that we've been locked in for so long. So everything does have its trade-offs, and I think not least when you actually put forward a complex compromise position that has been so carefully put together by my friend, the member for Grantham and Stamford, and others. It's very easy to take target at different points in that, to say I'm against that little bit, I'm against that little bit, and therefore I'm not going to vote for it. Nothing is perfect. Everything is about trade-off. So I would just, again, as I did last week, say to colleagues that we just need to all hold our noses about a number of things we might have concerns about, because we have to break this deadlock before we crash out a week on Thursday with no deal.
Mrs Anne Main.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We're being urged tonight to seek compromise, and yet it's not surprising to note that I think it was only 5 members of the Labour Party voted for the Prime Minister's withdrawal agreement. And I changed my vote for that because I could see this coming down the road at me. It's a very imperfect beast, and I've had a lot of criticisms about it. But tonight's vote shows you I don't wish to vote for any of the options on the table, but I'm asked to choose one. Well, I chose the Prime Minister's withdrawal agreement, and interestingly, 2 of the votes tonight will require a withdrawal agreement, as the honourable member alluded to. So C and D do not give us freedom of movement. They do not give us control over our immigration. I'm surprised to hear the 2 members who are advocating it talking about breaks. That is rather weasel words in my view, and I'm sorry to have to say that, but trying to reassure the SNP that they can have as many people coming over for freedom of movement by reassuring other members of the Labour Party they've got brakes on, that's playing both ends against the middle. The reality will be we will have very unlikely to have control over our migration policy, and if that is what honourable members want, then fine, but I don't think that's what came out in the debates. I am absolutely against a second referendum. I absolutely do not believe that we would be asking the same question for all intents and purposes. It would be a completely different referendum this time around. I don't know how anybody could explain on the doorstep why they chose to ignore the too difficult question of implementing the referendum. And I just would like to read these words to you because I agree with every one of them. 33.5 million people vote to cast the vote, 72% of the electorate, turnout at a level not seen since the 1922 election. No matter which side of the argument won, it was inevitable there'd be people left disappointed. That's the nature of debates, elections and referendums. It's fundamentally undemocratic to argue the process should be rerun because the outcome was not what some people wanted. Arguments of turnout, majority or accuracy or otherwise as statements made throughout the course of the campaign do not invalidate the result. Your words, Mr. Speaker, and I agree with every single one of them.
As politicians, we practice the art of politics, and the art of politics is the art of compromise. I've sat here now for 4.5 hours, and that is the #1 word. That's the most commonest word that's been used over the past 4.5 hours is compromise, because it's through compromise that we get progress. And we've had no progress for nearly 3 years. And I think one of the main reasons behind that is the hubris, the arrogance and the overconfidence of the Prime Minister and the former Prime Minister and leading Conservatives. And I go back to David Cameron when he decided to call for a referendum. Jean-Claude Juncker said to him, "Why have you done this?" He said, "Don't worry, I can deliver a 66% yes vote." Juncker said to him, "I couldn't get that in Luxembourg." There was hubris by the Prime Minister when she called for the election in 2017, and I'm not criticising her for that. By calling for that election, she allowed me to get back in through the back door. But she thought she was going to get a majority of 160, and she lost her majority. It was said by the Chief Whip today, she should have took cognizance, she should have took recognition of the result of that election. And I think he's a very wise man in saying that, and I congratulate him, a very brave man indeed. But that hubris was practised also by her ministers. Who remembers these quotes? Who remembers these quotes? The Brexit negotiations will take 10 minutes. Peter Lilly. The free trade agreement that we will do with the EU should be one of the easiest in human history. The right honourable member for North Somerset. So the election result was very, very close. She could have reached out across the chamber, across the country. She failed to do so, and that's why we're here today. So I urge all members to vote for compromise tonight. I'm going to be voting for the 4 options put before us, and I ask other members to do so.
Mr. Speaker, there are huge divisions in our country, and though I voted Remain, I don't support a second referendum or revoking previous decisions because I don't think that that would heal our divisions. But having no deal with our largest trading partner is unacceptable. It brings huge risks to our economy and brings uncertainty on the Irish border. I voted 3 times for the Prime Minister's deal. It's a bespoke deal, and to me it is the best option. But it has failed 3 times. Saying no to everything doesn't work. We need a compromise, and I will support a customs union this evening. That is not the same as the customs union we are in today. You could be in a customs union, but out of the CFP, out of the Common Agricultural Policy, and out of free movement. All of these were big issues in the referendum. Yes, we would follow the same tariffs on goods, but we wouldn't have to follow the same regulation on goods. And on services, the key part of our economy, we will be free to have our own regulations and free to have our own trade deals with other parts of the world. It does not involve handing over our trade policy to Brussels, because a country, Britain's side, would influence Brussels policy, and even Turkey retains its own say on trade sanctions. But, Mr. Speaker, fundamentally, the issue here is deliverability. We could be in a customs union, combine that with the withdrawal agreement and deal with it all on the future framework. This could all be done by May the 22nd, and we would not need to have ever extensions or another European election.
Mr. Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow the honourable member for Chelmsford, and there, I suggest, is the real rub of what is going on, or the danger we face tonight if we don't look at what's behind what seems like a lot of sensible compromise, because my real fear is, whatever we vote for, unless it's E and G, which I will vote for, then the government will, as the honourable member for Exeter put it in the bag, put forward yet again for another vote the Prime Minister's withdrawal agreement, and slip into the political declaration either the Customs Union or the so-called Common Market 2. I won't vote for the Customs Union because it doesn't deliver the frictionless trade that our manufacturing section desperately needs. And my concern about option or motion D is exactly that. And the honourable gentleman says compromise, and I hear exactly what he says, but it wouldn't be in the withdrawal...
Order. Thank you. Colleagues, voting forms are available from the vote office and in the division lobbies. Voting, as colleagues will know, is about to start at the end of this statement/announcement and will continue for 30 minutes from the moment it starts. I'll repeat now what I said the other day for the avoidance of doubt and for the sake of clarity. The forms look very similar to deferred division forms, except that they're blue, and they will list the title and letter of the selected motions. The text of the motions is in the order paper. Colleagues, members with surnames from A to K should hand their forms in the I lobby at the relevant desk for their surname, and members with surnames from L to Z should hand in their forms in the No lobby at the relevant desk. As with deferred divisions, members may not, I repeat, members may not vote aye and no to the same motion. If this happens, the vote will not be counted. As with deferred divisions, members may not hand in forms on behalf of other members. Each member must hand in his or her own form. Members with proxy votes in operation will need to get their nominated proxy to hand in their form. A short note is available in the vote office confirming these arrangements. I will announce the results in the chamber as soon as they're ready. Those results will be published in the same way as deferred divisions on the Commons Votes website and app, and in Hansard, showing how each honourable member voted on each motion. Voting is due to start now, and colleagues have 30 minutes to cast their votes. The sitting is suspended. Order. Order.